Section 1 of Clever Hans, The Horse of Mr. von Osten. A contribution to experimental, animal and human psychology by Oskar Pfungst, with an introduction by Professor C. Stumpf and 1 illustration and 15 figures. Translated from the German by Karl L. Rahn, Fellow in Psychology in the University of Chicago, with a prefatory note by James R. Angel, Professor of Psychology in the University of Chicago. Prefatory note by James R. Angel, the University of Chicago. It gives me great pleasure to accept the invitation of the publishers to write a word of introduction for Mr. Rahn's excellent translation of Der kluge Hans, a book which in the original has been but little known to American readers. The present wave of interest in animal life and behaviour renders its appearance peculiarly appropriate. No more remarkable tale of credulity found on unconscious deceit was ever told, and were it offered as fiction it would take high rank as a work of imagination. Being in reality a record of sober fact, it verges on the miraculous. After reading Mr. Pfungst's story, one can quite understand how sedate and sober Germany was for months thrown into a turmoil of newspaper debate, which for intensity and range of feeling finds its only parallel in a heated political campaign. That the subject of the controversy was the alleged ability of a trained horse to solve complex arithmetical problems may excite gaiety and even derision until one hears the details. Scientists and scholars of the highest eminence were drawn into the conflict, which has not yet wholly subsided, although the present report must be regarded as quite final in its verdict. As for Hans himself, he has become the prototype of a host of less distinguished imitators, representing every level of animal life, and when last heard from he was still entertaining mystified audiences by his accomplishments. But the permanent worth of the book is not to be found in its record of popular excitement, interesting as that is. It is a document of the very first consequence in its revelation of the workings of the animal mind as disclosed in the horse. Animal lovers of all kinds, whether scientists or laymen, will find in it material of the greatest value for the correct apprehension of animal behaviour. Moreover, it affords an illuminating insight into the technique of experimental psychology in its study both of human and animal consciousness. Finally, it contains a number of highly suggestive observations bearing on certain aspects of telepathy and muscle reading. All things considered, it may fairly be said that few scientific books appeal to so various a range of interests in so vital a way. Readers who wish to inform themselves of all the personal circumstances in the case may best read the text just as it stands. Those who desire to get at the pith of the matter without reference to its historical settings may be advised to admit the introduction by Professor Stumpf of the University of Berlin, together with supplements 2, 3 and 4. Introduction by C. Stumpf. A horse that solves correctly problems in multiplication and division by means of tapping, persons of unimpeachable honour, who in the master's absence have received responses, and assure us that in the process they have not made even the slightest sign. Thousands of spectators, horse fanciers, trick trainers of the first rank, and not one of them during the course of many months' observations are able to discover any kind of regular signal. That was the riddle, and its solution was found in the unintentional minimal movements of the horse's questioner. Simple though it may seem, the history of the solution is nevertheless quite complex, and one of the important incidents in it is the appearance of the zoologist and African traveller Schillings upon the scene. And then there is the report of the so-called Hans Commission of September 12, 1904. And finally there is the scientific investigation, the results of which were published in my report of December 9, 1904. After a cursory inspection during the month of February, I again called upon Mr. von Osten in July and asked him to explain to Professor Schumann and me just what method he had used in instructing the horse. We hoped in this way to gain a clue to the mechanism of Hans's feats. The most essential parts of the information thus gleaned are summarized in Supplement 1. Mr. Schillings came into the courtyard for the first time about the middle of July. He came as sceptical as everyone else, but after he, himself, had received correct responses, he too became convinced. and devoted much of his time to exhibiting the horse and daily brought new guests. To be perfectly frank, at this time it seemed to us a disturbing factor in the investigation. But now we see that his intervention was a link in the chain of events which finally led to an explanation. For it was through him that the fact was established beyond cavil that the horse was able to respond to strangers in the master's absence. Heretofore this had been noted only in isolated cases. Since it could not be assumed that a well-known investigator should take it upon himself to mislead the public by intentionally giving signs, the case necessarily from that time on appeared in the eyes of others in a light quite different from that in which ordinary circus tricks would appear, to which it bore such a striking external resemblance. No matter how this state of affairs might have arisen in the course of years, no matter how it might eventually be explained, the quality of the extraordinary would necessarily attach itself to this particular case as it did. Of course, to many persons in the interested public the result was merely that Schillings, also, was placed in the category of deceivers. On the other hand, there were reputable scientists who could not dispose of the matter in that fashion, and these now openly took their stand with Schillings and declared that they believed in the horse's ability to think. Zoologists especially saw in von Osten's results evidence of the essential similarity between the human and the animal mind, which doctrine has been coming more and more into favour since the time of Darwin. Educators were disposed to be convinced, on account of the clever systematic method of instruction which had been used and which had not, till then, been applied in the education of a horse. In addition, there were many details which, it seemed, could not be explained in any other way. So far as I myself was concerned, I was ready to change my views with regard to the nature of animal consciousness as soon as a careful examination would show that nothing else would explain the facts, except the assumption of the presence of conceptual thinking. I had thought out the process hypothetically, i.e., how one might conceive of the rise of number concepts and arithmetic calculation along the peculiar lines which had been followed in Hans's education, and on the basis of the assumption that the beginnings of conceptual thinking are present in animals. Also, I had too much faith in human nature to fear lest nothing peculiarly human should remain after the art of handling numbers should be shown to be common property with the lower forms. But under no circumstances would I have undertaken to make a public statement in favour of any particular view in this extraordinary case before a thorough investigation, in accordance with scientific principles, had been made. I expressed this sentiment at the time and recommended the appointment of an investigating commission in the Tag of September 3rd, 1904. The purpose of this commission was misunderstood, and therefore many were disappointed with the report which it published, Supplement 2. Some had been expecting a positive, conclusive explanation. The commission recommended further investigation. Some had asked for a solution of the question whether or not the horse was able to think. The commission maintained neither the one nor the other. Some had indicated as the main condition of a satisfactory investigation that both Mr. von Osten and Mr. Schillings be excluded from the tests. This was not done. But the commission, which by the way did not give itself this name, since it had been delegated by no one, undoubtedly had the right to formulate its problem as it saw fit, and this was carefully expressed at the beginning of its report as follows. The undersigned came together for the purpose of investigating the question whether or not there is involved in the feats of the horse of Mr. von Osten anything of the nature of tricks, that is, intentional influence or aid on the part of the questioner. It was this preliminary question, not whether or not the horse could think, which the commission intended to answer. They proposed to act as a sort of court of honour for the two gentlemen who had been attacked. It is only in this light that even the raison d'être of this body can be understood. For a scientific commission composed of 13 men, possessed of varying degrees of scientific preparation, would have been an absurd travesty, and it will readily be seen why the two men who had been attacked should not be excluded, since it was they, and primarily Mr. von Osten, upon whom the observations were to be made. To be sure, the Commission did go one step beyond that which it had proposed to itself, since it added that it believed that unintentional signs of the kind which are present familiar were also excluded. This led many to the unwarranted conclusion that the Commission had declared that Hans was able to think, whereas the thing that might have been logically suggested was that instead of the assumption of the presence of independent thinking, the Commission may have had in mind unintentional signs of a kind hitherto unknown. I explained this to a reporter of the Frankfurter Zeitung, Mr. A. Gold, who had come to me for information, and in his article he made this hypothesis appear as the most probable one. Footnote: Frankfurter Zeitung of September 22, 1904. Concerning the question whether the horse was given some sort of aid, Professor Stumpf expressed himself freely. He said, "We were careful to state in our report that the intentional use of the actual means of training on the part of the horse's teacher is out of the question, nor are there involved any of the known kinds of unconscious, involuntary aids. Our task was completed after we had ascertained that no tricks or aids of the traditional sort were being employed." After some remarks on unconscious habituation and self-training on the part of animals, the writer arrives at the conclusion that "the horse of Mr. von Osten has been educated by its master in the most roundabout way, in accordance with a method suited for the development of human reasoning powers, hence in all good faith to give correct responses by means of tapping with the foot." But what the horse really learned by this wearisome process was something quite different, something that was more in accord with his natural capacities. He learned to discover by purely sensory aids which are so nearly the threshold that they are imperceptible for us and even for the teacher, when he is expected to tap his foot and when he is to come to rest. End of footnote. Certain statements of the circus manager Busch, who speaks of a "connection" of some sort, go to show that other members of the Commission held to the view just stated. But how did it come to pass that the Commission should deny completely the presence of intentional signals, while, as regards the unintended, it excluded only those which were of the known sort? The report clearly shows that the decision as to the absence of voluntary signals was based not merely upon the fact that no such signals had been detected by the most expert observers, but also upon the character of the two men who exhibited the horse, upon their behaviour during the entire period, and upon the method of instruction which Mr. von Osten had employed. In the case of unintentional signs, on the other hand, one had to deal with the fact with which physiologists and experimental psychologists are especially familiar, namely, that our conscious states, without our willing it, indeed even in spite of us, are accompanied by bodily changes which very often can be detected only by the use of extremely fine graphic methods. The following is a more general instance. Every mother who detects the lie or divines the wish in the eyes of the child, knows that there are characteristic changes of facial expression which are, nevertheless, very difficult of definition. Footnotes. From the productions of the thought readers we see how slight and seemingly insignificant the unconscious movements may be, which serve as signs for a sensitive reagent. But in this case no contact is necessary. There would have to be some sort of visible or audible expression on the part of the questioner. No proof for this has yet been advanced. How anyone possessing the power of logical thought could possibly infer from these words of mine, published in the above mentioned article in the Tag, that I denied the possibility of the occurrence of visual signs, is to me incomprehensible. What I did deny, and still deny, is that up to that time any had been proven to occur. End of footnotes. The Commission did not even maintain or believe that unintentional signs within the realm of the senses known to us were to be excluded. Professor Nagel and I would never have subscribed to any such conclusion. The sentence in question, therefore, could only be interpreted as follows: that signals of the kind that are used intentionally in the training of horses could not have occurred even as unintended signs, for otherwise Mr. Busch would have detected them. and in order to be observed by him it was immaterial whether they were given purposely or not. The same signs, therefore, which as a result of his observations were declared not to be present, could not be assumed to be involved as unintentional. For my part, I am ready to confess that at this time I did not expect to find the involuntary signals, if any such were involved, in the form of movements. I had in mind rather some sort of nasal whisper such as had been invoked by the Danish psychologist A. Lehmann in order to explain certain cases of so-called telepathy. I could not believe that a horse could perceive movements which escaped the sharp eye of the circus manager. To be sure, extremely slight movements may still be perceived after objects at rest have become imperceptible, but one would hardly expect this feat on the part of an animal, who was so deficient in keenness of vision, as we have been led, by those of presumably expert knowledge, to believe of the horse. One would expect it all the less because Mr. von Osten and Mr. Schillings would move hither and thither in most irregular fashion while the horse was going through his tapping, and would therefore make the perception of minute movements all the more difficult. Nor was there anything in the exhibitions given at the same time in a Berlin vaudeville by the mare Rosa, which might have shattered this belief, for in the case of this rival of Hans the movements involved were comparatively coarse. The closing signal consisted in bending forward on the part of the one exhibiting the mare, while up to that point he had stood bolt upright. Most persons were not aware of this, because this change in posture cannot be noticed from the front. I happened to sit to the side and caught the movement every time. It was the same that was noted by Dr. Meisner, another member of the Commission (see page 256), but concerning which he did not give me a more complete account. Later I learned through Professor Th.W. Engelmann that the very same movement was employed not long ago for giving signals to a dog exhibited at Utrecht. This particular movement is very well adapted to commercial purposes, since the spectator always tries to view the performance from a point as nearly in front of the animal and its master as possible, thus making the detection of the trick all the more difficult. The details of the various experiments made by this commission are given in an excerpt from the records kept by Dr. von Hornbostel, which I showed to a small group of persons a few days after the 12th of September, Supplement 3. At that time none of the particulars was published, because the Commission wished to wait until some positive statement might be made. The public was merely to be assured that a group of reputable men from different spheres of life, who could have no purpose in hazarding their reputation, believed that the case was one worthy of careful investigation. I left Berlin on September 17th and did not return until October 3rd. In the meantime Mr. Schillings continued the investigation and was assisted in part by Mr. Oskar Pfungst, one of my co-workers at the Psychological Institute. For the first time a number of tests were now made in which neither the questioner nor any of those present knew the answer to the problem. Such tests naturally were the first steps towards a positive investigation. The results were such that Mr. Schillings was led to replace his hypothesis of independent conceptual thinking by one of some kind of suggestion. In this he was strengthened somewhat by having noted the fact that in his questions which he had put to the horse he might proceed as far as to ask the impossible. He has always been ready to offer himself in the tests which have been undertaken since then. On October 13, 1904, together with the two gentlemen mentioned in the beginning of my report, I began my more detailed investigation and finished on November 29th. We worked for several hours on the average of 4 times each week. I take this opportunity of giving expression of the recognition which is due to the two gentlemen. They were ready to go to the courtyard in all kinds of weather, at times they went without me, and they always patiently discussed the order and method of the experiments and the results. Dr. von Hornbostel had the important task of keeping the record, and Mr. Pfungst undertook the conduct of the experiments. It was he who, soon after the blinder tests disclosed the necessary presence of visual signs, discovered the nature of these signs. Without him we might have shown the horse to be dependent on visual stimuli in general, but we never would have been able to gain that mass of detail which makes the case valuable for human psychology. But I am tempted to praise not merely his patience and skill, but also his courage. For we must not believe that Mr. von Osten's horse was a perfectly gentle animal. If he stood untied and happened to be excited by some sudden occurrence, he would make that courtyard an unsafe place, and both Mr. Schillings and Mr. Pfungst suffered from more than one bite. In this connection I would also express my obligations to Count Otto zu Castel-Rudenhausen for his frequent intercessions on our behalf with the owner of the horse, and for his many evidences of goodwill and helpfulness. After the publication of this report, Supplement 4, there was still some further discussion of the case in societies of various kinds and in the press, but no important objections were raised. A hippologist thought that men of his calling should have been consulted. A telepathist believed that telepathists should have been called in. There was also some further talk of suggestion, will transference, thought reading, and the occult, but no attempt was made to elucidate these vague terms with reference to their application to the case in hand. Others adhered to the old cry of fraud, for a share of which Mr. Pfungst now fell heir. There were a few who felt it incumbent upon themselves to preserve their priority, and therefore stated with a show of satisfaction that I had finally confessed myself to hold their respective points of view. As if there were anything like confessions in science. As if mere affirmations, even though sealed and deposited in treasure vaults, had any value with reference to a case in which every manner of supposition had been advanced in lieu of explanation. Why did they wait so long if they had convincing proof for their position? And finally there were disappointed Darwinists who expressed fear lest ecclesiastical and reactionary points of view should derive favourable material from the conclusions arrived at in my report. Needless fear. For lovers of truth it must always remain a matter of inconsequence whether anyone is pleased or displeased with the truth, and whether it is enunciated by Aristotle or Haeckel. Mr. von Osten, however, continued to exhibit hants, and is probably doing so still, but in what frame of mind I dare not judge. The spectators continue to look on, they are doubly alert to catch movements, and many of them have learned from Mr. Schillings what kind of movements they are to expect, but these initiated ones regularly return and declare that there is nothing in the movements, and that they simply could not discover any aids given to the horse. Nothing can so well show how difficult the case is and how great the need of a thorough exposition of the whole matter than the account given in the following pages by Mr. Pfungst. Its publication has been delayed on account of the additional tests made in the laboratory, but we have reason to suppose that through these additional tests the work has gained its permanent value. Experimental psychologists will perhaps be greatly interested in the graphic registration of the minute involuntary movements which accompany the thought process, and in the artificial association of the given involuntary movements with a given idea. Likewise the tests on sense perception in horses, which have led to essential changes in hitherto current views, and the critical review of the comprehensive literature on similar achievements in other animals, will be welcomed by many. Before closing these introductory remarks, I would make one more statement concerning Mr. von Osten. The reader will notice that the judgment passed upon him in this treatise is placed at the end, whereas in the report of the Commission it came first. This was brought about by the change that was made in the way of stating the problem. Then the question discussed was whether tricks were involved. Now the question is, what is the mechanism of the process? The question of the good faith of the master was taken up once more only because the facts that were brought to light by the later experimentation seemingly brought forth new grounds for distrust. But by placing this discussion towards the end of our report, we wished to indicate that everything that it said of the present status of fact is quite independent of the view taken concerning Mr. von Osten. Even assuming that the horse had been purposely trained by him to respond to this kind of signal, the case would still deserve a place in the annals of science. For visual signs, planned and practised so that they could not only be more readily perceived by the animal than by man, but could be transferred from their inventor to others without any betrayal of the secret, this would be an extraordinary invention, and Mr. von Osten would then be a fraud but also a genius of first rank. In truth, he probably was neither, but I was brief in my report, for otherwise I would have been obliged to go into more detail than the case warranted. And a judgment passed upon a human personality is quite a different matter from a judgment upon a horse. If it is unscientific to make unqualified statements concerning a horse after the performance of only a few experimental tests, it is certainly an unwarranted thing to pass a moral judgment upon a man upon the basis of meagre material. Anyone who would assume the role of judge should bear in mind that here too we have more than 100-fold the material which they could bring forward, and among it some which, if taken alone, would be more unfavourable than any that they had. But here all things should be weighed together and not in isolation. A former instructor of mathematics in a German gymnasium, a passionate horseman and hunter, extremely patient and at the same time highly irascible, liberal in permitting the use of the horse for days at a time, and again tyrannical in the insistence upon foolish conditions, clever in his method of instruction, and yet at the same time possessing not even the slightest notion of the most elementary conditions of scientific procedure. All this and more goes to make up the man. He is fanatic in his conviction. He has an eccentric mind which is crammed full of theories from the phrenology of Gaul to the belief that the horse is capable of inner speech and thereby enunciates inwardly the number as it proceeds with the tapping. From theories such as these, and on the basis of all sorts of imagined emotional tendencies in the horse, he also managed to formulate an explanation for the failure of the tests in which none of the persons present knew the answer to the problem given the horse, and also for the failure of those tests in which the large blinders were applied. And he would often interfere with or hinder other tests which, according to his point of view, were likely to lead us astray. And yet, when the first tests with the blinders did turn out as unmistakably sheer failures, there was such genuine surprise, such tragicomic rage directed against the horse, that we finally believed that his views in the matter would be changed beyond a doubt. The gentleman must admit, he said at the time, that after seeing the objective success on my efforts at instruction, I was warranted in my belief in the horse's power of independent thought. Nevertheless, upon the following day he was as ardent an exponent of the belief in the horse's intelligence as he had ever been. And finally, after I could no longer keep from him the results of our investigation, I received a letter from him in which he forbade further experimentation with the horse. The purpose of our inquiries, he said, had been to corroborate his theories. On account of his withdrawal of the horse, a few experimental series unfortunately could not be completed, but happily the major portion of our task had been accomplished. End of section 1. Section 2. Chapter 1. The problem of animal consciousness and clever hands. If we would appreciate the interest that has been aroused everywhere by the wonderful horse-solving arithmetical problems, we must first consider briefly the present state of the problem of animal consciousness. Footnote. Since the present treatise is intended for the larger public, this brief resume will probably be welcome to many. End of footnote. Animal consciousness cannot be directly gotten at, and the psychologist must therefore seek to appreciate it on the basis of the animal's behaviour and with the assistance of conceptions borrowed from human psychology. Hence it is that animal psychology rests upon uncertain foundations, with the result that the fundamental principles have been repeatedly questioned and agreement has not yet been attained. The most important of these questions is, does the animal possess consciousness, and is it like the human consciousness? Comparative psychologists divide into three groups on this question. The one group allows consciousness to the lower forms, but emphasizes the assertion that between the animal and the human consciousness there is an impassable gap. The animal may have sensations and memory images of sensations, which may become associated in manifold combinations. Both sensations and memory images are believed to be accompanied by conditions of pleasure and of pain, so-called sensuous feelings, and these in turn become the mainsprings of desire. The possession of memory gives the power of learning through experience, but with this the inventory of the content of animal consciousness is exhausted. The ability to form concepts. Footnote. Ideas are copies of former sensations, feelings and other psychic experiences and retain also the accidental signs which belong to those earlier experiences. They are images in the concrete, such as the memory of a certain horse in a certain definite situation, say a well-fed, long-tailed one standing at a manger. A concept, on the other hand, is a mental construct which has its rise in ideas, or memory images, in that their essential characteristics are abstracted. For this reason the concept has not a definite image content, thus the thought of horse in general is a concept. Not so the thought of a certain individual horse, that is an idea with a definite image content. End of footnote. And with their aid make judgments and draw conclusions is denied the lower forms. All the higher intellectual, aesthetic and moral feelings, as well as volition guided by motives, are also denied. Among the ancients this view was held by Aristotle and the Stoics, and following them it was taught by the Christian Church. It pervaded all medieval philosophy, which grew out of the teachings of Aristotle and the Church. It is this philosophy, in the form of Neo-Thomism, which still obtains in the Catholic world. During the 17th century, even though temporarily, another conception of the consciousness of lower forms came to prevail, and was introduced by Descartes, the father of modern philosophy. Far more radical than the earlier conception, it denied to animals not only the power of abstract thought, but every form of psychic life whatever, and reduced the lower form to a machine which automatically reacted upon external stimuli. This daring view, however, prevailed for only a comparatively short period, but owing to the opposition which it aroused, it gave a tremendous impetus to the study of animal consciousness. Most of the great philosophers following Descartes, such as Locke, Leibniz, Kant and Schopenhauer, however greatly they may have differed in other points, in this one returned to the Aristotelian point of view. A third belief avers that animal and human consciousness do not differ in essentials, but only in degree. This conclusion is regularly arrived at by those who regard so-called abstract thought itself as simply a play of individual sensations and sensation images, as did the French and British associationists, Condillac and the Mills. The superiority of man accordingly consisted in his ability to form more intricate ideational complexes. Again, this conception of the essential similarity of the human and the animal psyche has also always been arrived at by the materialists, from Epicurus to Seevogt and Büchner, who impute reason to the animal form as well as to man. The same position is, furthermore, taken by the evolutionists, including those who do not subscribe to the doctrines of materialism. It has almost become dogma with them that there exists an unbroken chain of psychic life from the lowest protozoa to man. Haeckel, preeminently, though not always convincingly, sought to establish such a graded series and thus to bridge the chasm between the human and the animal consciousness. Two tendencies, therefore, are discernible in animal psychology. The one seeks to remove the animal psyche farther away from the human, the other tries to bring the two closer together. It is undoubtedly true that many acts of the lower forms reveal nothing of the nature of conceptual thinking, but that others might thus be interpreted cannot be denied. But need they be thus interpreted? There lies the dispute. A single incontrovertible fact which would fulfil this demand, i.e. proof of conceptual thinking, would, at a stroke, decide the question in favour of those who ascribe the power of thought to the lower forms. At last the thing so long sought for was apparently found. A horse that could solve arithmetical problem. A horse which, thanks to long training, mastered not merely rudiments, but seemingly arrived at a power of abstract thought and which surpassed by far the highest expectations of the greatest enthusiasts. And now what was it that this wonderful horse could do? The reader may accompany us to an exhibition which was given daily before a select company at about the noon hour in a paved courtyard surrounded by high apartment houses in the northern part of Berlin. No fee was ever taken. The visitor might walk about freely and if he wished might closely approach the horse and its master, a man between 60 and 70 years of age. His white head was covered with a black slouch hat. To his left the stately animal, a Russian trotting horse, stood like a docile pupil, managed not by means of the whip, but by gentle encouragement and frequent reward of bread or carrots. He would answer correctly nearly all the questions which were put to him in German. If he understood a question, he immediately indicated this by a nod of the head. If he failed to grasp its import, he communicated the fact by a shake of the head. We were told that the questioner had to confine himself to a certain vocabulary, but this was comparatively rich, and the horse widened its scope daily without special instruction, but by simple contact with his environment. His master, to be sure, was usually present whenever questions were put to the horse by others, but in the course of time he gradually responded to a greater and greater number of persons. Even though Hans did not appear as willing and reliable in the case of strangers as in the case of his own master, this might easily be explained by the lack of authoritativeness on their part and of affection on the part of Hans, who for the last 4 years had had intercourse only with his master. Our intelligent horse was unable to speak, to be sure. His chief mode of expression was tapping with his right forefoot. A good deal was also expressed by means of movement of the head. Thus yes was expressed by a nod, no by a deliberate movement from side to side, and upward, upper, downward, right, left were indicated by turning the head in these directions. In this he showed an astonishing ability to put himself in the place of his visitors. Upon being asked which arm was raised by a certain gentleman opposite him, Hans promptly answered by a movement to the right, even though seen from his side it would appear to be the left. Hans would also walk towards the persons or things that he was asked to point out, and he would bring from a row of coloured cloths the piece of the particular colour demanded. Taking into account his limited means of expression, his master had translated a large number of concepts into numbers, e.g. the letters of the alphabet, the tones of the scale, and the names of the playing cards were indicated by taps. In the case of playing cards, 1 tap meant ace, 2 taps king, 3 queen, etc. Let us turn now to some of his specific accomplishments. He had, apparently, completely mastered the cardinal numbers from 1 to 100 and the ordinals to 10 at least. Upon request he would count objects of all sorts, the persons present, even to distinctions of sex, then hats, umbrellas and eyeglasses. Even the mechanical activity of tapping seemed to reveal a measure of intelligence. Small numbers were given with a slow tapping of the right foot. With large numbers he would increase his speed and would often tap very rapidly right from the start, so that one might have gained the impression that knowing that he had a large number to tap, he desired to hasten the monotonous activity. After the final tap he would return his right foot, which he used in his counting, to its original position, or he would make the final count with a very energetic tap of the left foot, to underscore it as it were. 0 was expressed by a shake of the head. But Hans could not only count, he could also solve problems in arithmetic. The 4 fundamental processes were entirely familiar to him. Common fractions he changed to decimals and vice versa. He could solve problems in mensuration, and all with such ease that it was difficult to follow him if one had become somewhat rusty in these branches. The following problems are illustrations of the kind he solved. Footnote. All examples mentioned are cited from extant works of various observers. End of footnote. How much is 2/5 plus a half? Answer 9/10. In the case of all fractions, Hans would first tap the numerator, then the denominator. In this case, therefore, first 9, then 10. Or again, I have a number in mind. I subtract 9 and have 3 as the remainder. What is the number I had in mind? 12. What are the factors of 28? Thereupon Hans tapped consecutively 2, 4, 7, 14, 28. In the number 365,287,149, I place a decimal point after the 8. How many are there now in the hundreds place? 5. How many in the 10,000ths place? 9. It will be noticed, therefore, that he was able to operate with numbers far exceeding 100, indeed he could manipulate those of 6 places. We were told that this, however, was no longer arithmetic computation in the truest sense of the term. Hans merely knew after the analogy of 10 and 100 that the thousands take the 4th place, the 10,000s the 5th, etc. If an error entered into Hans's answer, he could nearly always correct it immediately upon being asked, by how many units did you go wrong? Hans, furthermore, was able to read the German readily, whether written or printed. Mr. von Osten, however, taught him only the small letters, not the capitals. If a series of placards with written words were placed before the horse, he could step up and point with his nose to any of the words required of him. He could even spell some of the words. This was done by the aid of a table devised by Mr. von Osten, in which every letter of the alphabet, as well as a number of diphthongs, had an appropriate place which the horse could designate by means of a pair of numbers. Thus, in the 5th horizontal row, S had first place, SCH second, SS third, etc., so that the horse would indicate the letter S by treading first 5, then 1, SCH by 5 and 2, SS by 5 and 3. Upon being asked, "What is this woman holding in her hand?" Hans spelled without hesitation 3, 2, 4, 6, 3, 7, i.e. Schirm, parasol. At another time a picture of a horse standing at a manger was shown to him, and he was asked, "What does this represent?" He promptly spelled Pferd, horse, and then Krippe, manger. He, moreover, gave evidence of an excellent memory. In passing we might also mention that he knew the names of all the German coins. But most astonishing of all was the following. Hans carried the entire yearly calendar in his head. He could give you not only the date for each day without having been previously taught anew, but he could give you the date of any day you might mention. He could also answer such inquiries as this. If the 8th day of a month comes on Tuesday, what is the date for the following Friday? He could also tell the time to the minute by a watch, and could answer offhand the question, between what figures is the small hand of a watch at 5 minutes after 7:30? Or, how many minutes has the large hand to travel between 7 minutes after 1/4 the hour and 3/4 past? Tasks that were given him but once would be repeated correctly upon request. The sentence Brücke und Weg sind vom Feinde besetzt, the bridge and the road are held by the enemy, was given to Hans one day, and upon the following day he tapped consecutively the 58 numbers which were necessary for a correct response. He recognized persons after having seen them but once, yes, even their photographs taken in previous years and bearing but slight resemblance. A corresponding high degree of sensory activity seems to accompany these astonishing feats of memory and reason. Although the horse is not usually credited with a very keen sense of vision, Hans was able to count the windows of distant houses and the street urchins climbing about on neighbouring roofs. He had an ear for the most subtle nuances of the voice. He caught every word, no matter how softly it was spoken, so that we were not allowed to whisper the answer to a problem, even when standing at a distance of several yards, since it would be equivalent, so Mr. von Osten declared, of giving the result to the horse. Musical ability also comes in the category of Hans's accomplishments. He possessed not only an absolute tone consciousness, a gift granted to few of us in the human world, which enabled him to recognize a note sounded or sung to him as C, D, etc., within the once accented scale of C major, but also an infallible feeling for intervals, and could therefore determine whether two tones, sounded simultaneously, compose a third or fifth, etc. Without difficulty he analysed compound clangs into their components. He indicated their agreeableness or disagreeableness, and could inform us which tones must be eliminated to make consonants out of dissonance. C, D and E were given simultaneously, and Hans was asked, "Does that sound pleasant?" He shook his head. What tone must be omitted to make it pleasant? Hans trod twice, indicating tone D. When the seventh chord, D, F, A, C, was sounded, he shook his head disapprovingly. He evidently was old-fashioned in his musical tastes and not agreeably disposed towards modern music. So he indicated by tapping that the seventh, C, would have to be eliminated, thus changing the seventh chord to a minor chord in order to obtain harmony. When asked what tones might not be given simultaneously with the fourth and sixth, Hans indicated consecutively the third, fifth and seventh. That the first might be added he was ready to admit. Finally, he was familiar with not less than 13 melodies and their time. Not only in the high degree of development of the senses and the intellect, but also in that of the feeling and the will, did Hans possess a decided individuality. Being of a high-strung and nervous temperament and governed by moods, he evinced strong likes and dislikes, and frequently displayed an annoying stubbornness, a fact often dwelt upon by Mr. von Osten. He had never felt the whip, and therefore often persisted in wilfully answering the simplest questions incorrectly, and a moment later would solve with the greatest ease some of the most difficult problems. Whenever anyone asked a question without himself knowing the answer, Hans would indulge in all sorts of sport at the questioner's expense. We were told that the sensitive animal could easily perceive the questioner's ignorance, and would therefore lose confidence in and respect for him. It was felt to be desirable, however, to have just such cases with correct responses. Often, too, Hans would persist in giving what seemed an incorrect reply, but which was later discovered to be correct. On the other hand, it was useless to try to get answers upon topics of which he knew nothing. Thus he ignored questions put in French or Latin and became fidgety, thereby showing the genuineness of his achievements, but upon topics with which he was familiar he could not be led astray. Indeed, there was nothing but language lacking to make him almost human, and the intelligent animal was declared by experienced educators to be at about the stage of development of a child of 13 or 14 years. This wonderful horse, which in the opinion of its friends was the means of deciding in the affirmative the old question of the rationality of the lower forms, and thus changing radically the existing Weltanschauung, aroused worldwide interest. A flood of articles appeared in the newspapers and magazines. 2 monograph attempts at explanation were devoted to him. He was made the subject of popular couplets, and his name was sung on the vaudeville stage. He appeared upon picture postcards and upon liquor labels, and his popularity was shown by his reincarnation in the form of children's playthings. Many personages of note who had seen the horse's exhibitions declared, some of them in public statements, that they were now convinced. Among these, besides Mr. Schillings, were naturalists of note, the African explorer Professor G. Schweinfurth, Dr. Heinroth and Dr. Schaff, the director of the Zoological Garden in Hanover. There were likewise horse fanciers of the first rank, such as General Zubel and the well-known hippological writer Major R. Schoenbeck. Again, the well-known zoologist K. Movius, writing in the National Zeitung, declared he was convinced of the horse's power to count and to solve arithmetical problems. He also said that he believed the horse's memory and acute power of sense discrimination to be at the root of the matter. Those who gleaned all their knowledge of the horse from newspaper reading were satisfied to arrest judgment, or, on the other hand, became indignant at the supposed imposition on the part of the gentleman of leisure and at the gullibility of the public. Some would of course attempt explanation on the basis of older facts. Here we have two points of view. Some try to explain the whole thing on the basis of purely mechanical memory, and would thus allow the title learned but not intelligent Hans. If, for instance, he was able to indicate the component of a clang of 3 tones, it was not because he had the power to analyse the tone complex, but because he was able to see the stops of the harmonica, and was accustomed to give 1 tap for every stop which was closed. If he was able to tell the time by the watch, it was not because he read it, but because he was always asked at the same hour of the day, which, of course, was contrary to fact, and because he had learned by heart the necessary number of taps. They also said that his manifold arithmetical achievements were merely the expression of a remarkable memory, that in the animal brain, lying fallow for centuries, there was stored up a tremendous amount of energy, which here had been suddenly released. They justified their point by calling to mind, in this connection, the wonderful memory of primitive races. The authors of the 2 monographs already mentioned, Zell and Freund, adopted this mnemotechnic interpretation, and the latter considered that he had disposed definitely of the problem in designating the horse a 4-legged computing machine. Another group would not even allow Hans the glory of a wonderful memory. He knew nothing. Rather, he was to be regarded as a stupid Hans, and totally dependent upon signs or helps given by his master. Only a very few believed, however, that such signs, the nature of which was quite unknown, or regarding which only vague unsubstantiated suppositions were advanced, were given unintentionally. Most of the critics openly averred that we here had to do with intentional control, in other words, with tricks. But not only did stupid orthodoxy dispose of the matter in this way, but also the enlightened who believe everything unusual to be contrary to reason. They put the Hans problem on a level with spiritualism, and were convinced that if the veil were removed a crass imposition would be revealed. Professional trainers who regarded themselves as well informed did not hesitate to give expression to this same view, even though they had observed Hans inadequately or not at all. The defenders of this second point of view were not at a loss to point out the signs supposed to be given to Hans. One of these believed he had discovered the primary means for giving these signals in the slouch hat of Mr. von Osten. It was no accident, they said, that Mr. Schillings wore a slouch hat when he experimented with the horse. It is sufficient to note that Mr. Schillings was usually bareheaded or wore only a cap when he tested the horse. Another accused, in like fashion, the long coat of the experimenter. A third, who had had opportunity to observe Hans on several occasions, declared with equal certainty that the cue lay in the movements of the hand as it was thrust into the pocket filled with carrots. One circus star declared that the trick lay in eye movement, another such star declared it lay in the movements of the hand, A sixth discovered that the signs were manifold and adds, to be sure, the trainer must have a fund of such signs in order to prevent embarrassment. Such a hypothesis is itself, it would seem, one of embarrassment. On the other hand, there were many first-class observers who vainly tried to discover regularly recurring signs, among them the only professional trainer who had devoted any satisfactory length of time to the horse and had also sought diligently for the signs in question, said, "I was fully convinced that I would be able to explain the problem in this way, but I was mistaken." The president of the Internationale Artistengenossenschaft, a person who knew all the means of control in trick performances, went over to the other side as a result of his observations. There were others who sought for auditory signs. The opinion was expressed that Hans was unable to answer the simplest questions, such as "What is 2 plus 3?" whenever the questioner's tone of voice differed from that of the master's. Another put chief stress upon the changing inflection. Furthermore, a high degree of auditory sensitivity was often offered in explanation. The sense of smell was also made to bear some burdens. With its help, for instance, Hans was believed to be able to recognize the photograph of someone present, supposing of course that the person had carried the picture about with him, thus allowing it to be impregnated with his peculiar personal odour. One even suggested that the heat radiating from the questioner's body and the electrical stimulus conducted underground to Hans's foot was sufficient explanation for his remarkable feats. Even the so-called N-rays of one-day fame, which was supposed to radiate from the human brain when in activity, were offered as a solution. A similar thing may have been in the mind of the natural philosopher, who even after the publication of the December report wrote as follows in one of the journals. On the basis of most careful control, I have come to the conclusion that the brain of the horse receives the thought waves which radiate from the brain of his master, for mental work is, according to the judgment of science, physical work. Of the same character are the explanations of two others, one of whom declares that Hans was acting under the magnetic influence of man, while the other declared that hypnotic suggestion is involved, and, ignoring a tested fact, tells us that the horse can execute the commands of another only when the master, with whom it is en rapport, wills that it shall obey. We may close the catalogue of explanations with one more which, in spite of its vagueness, found many defenders, namely, suggestion. Without defining this conception more specifically, and without the slightest notion of the peculiar difficulties which it involves, L. Lowenfeld in his Handbuch des Hypnotismus, Wiesbaden 1901, pages 35 and the following, cites 20 different definitions of the term given by as many authors. A critic writes, "The astounding phenomenon of this animal apparently possessing human reason is to be attributed solely to suggestion." Having referred to a dog trained for the vaudeville stage, the gentleman concludes that our intelligent horse, as well as the dog, is simply of fine nervous organization and hence highly susceptible to suggestion. What was to be done with this mass of conflicting explanations? Everyone considered his own opinion the only correct one, without, however, being able to convince anyone else. The need here was not simple affirmation, but proof. End of section 2. Section 3. Chapter 2. Experiments and Observations, Part 1. A. Experimental Conditions. The observations on the horse under ordinary conditions would have been quite insufficient for arriving at a decision as to the tenability of the several possible explanations. For this purpose experimentation with controlled conditions was necessary. It was necessary first that the place in which the experiments were performed should be guarded against sources of error and interruption. Several difficulties stood in the way of the removal of the horse to a more convenient place. Therefore a large canvas tent was erected within the courtyard of Mr. von Osten. This afforded the necessary isolation without hindering the free movements of the horse. After the essential part of the experiment had been completed, and the problem had been practically solved, experimentation was sometimes conducted in the open courtyard. A number of the experiments were also performed in the horse's stall. The choice of proper persons to experiment with the horse required careful consideration. Insofar as observations were to be made upon the questioner, Mr. von Osten was of course indispensable. But to obviate every objection, he, as well as Mr. Schillings, had to be excluded from the greater part of the experiments, and other persons had to be selected who could learn to handle the horse. Now, one would have thought that the horse would respond to any moderately efficient examiner, but as a matter of fact it was found that the horse would not react at all in the case of the greater number of persons. Again, in the case of others he would respond once or twice, but he would then cease. All told, Hans responded more or less readily to 40 persons, but it was only when he worked with Mr. von Osten or Mr. Schillings that his responses were at all dependable. For this reason I undertook to befriend the horse, and by happy chance it came to pass in a short time he responded as readily to my questions as to those of the two gentlemen. In a few of these experiments the Count zu Castel, Count R. von Matuschka, and Mr. Schillings undertook the rôle of questioner. Where these are not mentioned in the results here published, I myself did the questioning. With regard to the number of experiments and their performance, the following precautions were observed. A sufficiently large number of tests was made in each series in order to obviate the possibility of the contention that the horse's errors were due to chance. The conditions of experimentation were such that the further contention that he happened to be tired or otherwise indisposed whenever the reactions seemed to be inadequate could not be offered. The possibility of confusing the horse by means of unwanted conditions also had to be avoided. For this reason it was necessary to alternate the trial in which procedure was with the knowledge of the answer on the part of the questioner with the trial in which the procedure was without such knowledge. Such precautions had hitherto been neglected, and therefore those negative results which had been occasionally obtained in single trials could not claim objective validity, even though the persons making the tests were subjectively convinced. The course of the experiments was determined by the nature of the problem itself. By means of a very simple test it was possible to discover whether or not Hans was able to think independently. He was confronted with problems in which the procedure was without knowledge of the answer on the part of the questioner. If under these conditions he could respond with the correct answer, which could be the result of a rational process only, then the conclusion that he could think independently was warranted. The examination would be closed and Mr. von Osten would be justified in all he claimed for the horse. If, however, Hans should fail in this test, then the conclusion that he could think was by no means warranted, but rather the inference that he was dependent upon certain stimuli received from the questioner or the environment. Further investigation would be for the purpose of discovering the nature of these stimuli. To ascertain by means of which sense organ or organs the horse might receive these necessary stimuli, the method of elimination was employed. We began by excluding visual stimuli by means of a pair of very large blinders. Should this investigation be without result, we would proceed to test the sense of hearing. The elimination of auditory stimulations would be more difficult because ear caps or the closing of the passage by means of cotton would not give sufficient assurance that the sound waves were being interrupted, even if the horse were docile enough to suffer these appliances. Thereupon would follow the testing of the sense of smell and of the skin senses. Finally, there might be involved another still unknown sense, such as seems to exist in the lower animal forms. The reader therefore can readily see that the investigation might possibly have become very complex, and that the investigators had to be prepared for all these possibilities. The results of the experiments and the essential circumstances under which they were conducted were in every case recorded immediately. It goes without saying that in the final formulation of the results all values, including those which were not consonant with the majority, were to be used. B. Experimental results. During the course of these experiments Hans wore his accustomed trappings, i.e. a girdle, light headgear and snaffle, and he either stood alone, untied, or was held loosely by the bridle either by the questioner or, though only in a few instances, by his attendant. The questioner always stood to the right of the horse, as Mr. von Osten had been accustomed to do. As reward for correct responses Hans received from the questioner. Footnote. The expressions questioner and experimenter are used interchangeably in this treatise. End of footnote. And from him only a bit of bread or carrot, and at times also a square of sugar. Never was a whip applied. From time to time the horse was led about the courtyard, or was allowed to run loose in order to secure the needful respite. Besides myself, there was usually present Professor Stumpf and Dr. von Hornbostel, who kept the records, and frequently also Mr. von Osten. Several times I worked alone with the horse. The results obtained in the horse's stall were in no respect different from those got in the course of the experiments carried on in the courtyard. Whenever a doubt arose as to the number of taps made by the horse, though this did not frequently occur, then the series in question was immediately repeated. In this report of the results of our experiments, the reader must bear in mind that it was impossible to adhere to that order and distribution of tests which we are wont to require in the case of psychophysical experiments conducted under regular laboratory conditions. All sorts of difficulties had to be overcome, unfavourable weather, the crowds of curious ones, certain peculiarities of the horse, such as shying whenever the wind rippled the canvas of the tent, and last but not least, the idiosyncrasies of Mr. von Osten, who repeatedly attempted to interrupt the progress of the experiments. Since it was evident that different kinds of processes were involved in solving the problems, and since the solutions would be indicated by tapping, or by movement of the head, or by walking over to the object to be designated, the results of these three sets of experiments have to be grouped under three corresponding heads. 1. Problems solved by tapping. The following tests were made in which the method was such that when the problem was presented to the horse, the correct solution was known to none of those present, least of all to the questioner. This method we shall designate in the following report as procedure without knowledge, whereas we shall call the method in which the answer was known to the questioner procedure with knowledge. In order to discover if the horse could read numbers, a series of cards on which numerals were blazoned were exposed to the horse's view in such a way that none of those present was able to see them, and the horse was asked to tap the numbers as they were shown. This experiment was repeated at different times, and in all there were 49 tests in which procedure was without knowledge, and 42 in which procedure was with knowledge. In the case of the former there were 8% correct responses, whereas in the latter 98% of the answers were right. As an example of the course which the series tended to take, we insert the following, in which Mr. von Osten himself acted as questioner. Without knowledge, number exposed 8, number tapped 14. With knowledge, number exposed 8, number tapped 8. Without knowledge, number exposed 4, number tapped 8. With knowledge, number exposed 4, number tapped 4. Without knowledge, number exposed 7, number tapped 9. With knowledge, number exposed 7, number tapped 7. Without knowledge, number exposed 10, number tapped 17. With knowledge, number exposed 10, number tapped 10. Without knowledge, number exposed 3, number tapped 9. With knowledge, number exposed 3, number tapped 3, etc. Whenever the questioner knew the solution, nearly all of the horse's answers were correct, but when the answers were unknown to the questioner, the horse's response were, with only a few exceptions, quite unsuccessful. Since the few exceptional cases must be regarded as fortuitous, the conclusion is warranted that the horse was unable to read numerals without assistance. In order to discover whether the horse could read words, such as Hans or Stuhl, or the names of colours, they were written upon placards and hung up in a row before the horse in such a way that the questioner could see the individual word but could not immediately recognize the particular place that each one occupied in the series. The horse was then asked, upon which placard is the word Hans, on which is the word Stuhl, etc. In order to make sure, he was required to repeat each answer. Then the experimenter would determine for himself the place of the word in the series and would ask the question again. 14 such tests in which the procedure was with knowledge on the part of the questioner were interspersed with 12 in which the procedure was without such knowledge. With the latter there were no correct responses, whereas in the case of procedure with knowledge 100% of the answers were correct. Evidently the horse could not read words. 3 words were thereupon whispered in his ear, which he was asked to spell in accordance with the method described on page 21. Since he had to indicate first the row and then the place in the row occupied by the letter, it took 2 answers to indicate the position of each letter. I acted as questioner. The ordering of the table of letters was unknown to me, except the position of the letter A, which naturally came first, and the place of the letter S, concerning whose position I had purposely inquired. The words chosen for this experiment were arm, Rom, Rome, and Hans. The horse responded incorrectly in the case of every letter which was unknown to the questioner. A and S alone were given correctly. Thus, in spelling the word Rom, the horse responded with the series 3, 4, 3, 4, 5, 4, 5, 4, i.e. JJST, instead of the correct series 4, 6, 4, 2, 3, 7. I later selected 3 other words, the spelling of which involved the tapping of 32 numbers on the part of Hans, and whose positions I had carefully ascertained beforehand. When these were given to the horse to spell, he responded promptly without a single error. Evidently Hans was unable to spell without assistance of some sort from the questioner. The horse's reputed aptitude in computation was tested in the following way. Mr. von Osten whispered a number in the horse's ear so that none of the persons present could hear. Thereupon I did likewise. Hans was asked to add the 2. Since each of the experimenters knew only his own number, the sum, if known to anyone, could be known to Hans alone. Every such test was immediately repeated with the results known to the experimenters. In 31 tests in which the method was procedure without knowledge, 3 of the horse's answers were correct, whereas in the 31 tests in which the method was procedure with knowledge, 29 of his responses were correct. Since the 3 correct answers in the cases in which the procedure was without knowledge evidently were accidental, the results of this series of experiments shows that Hans was unable to solve arithmetical problems. For the purpose of discovering whether the horse could at least count, the Russian kindergarten device, which Mr. von Osten had used in training, was utilized. The machine was placed before the horse, but the experimenter turned his back on it. Before each test a number of balls were pushed to one side, and Hans's problem was to indicate the number thus separated. Each test was repeated with procedure with knowledge. Of 8 such experiments, Hans responded successfully every time procedure was with knowledge, but failed every time procedure was without knowledge. Thus 7 balls were at one time designated as 9 and later as 14, while 6 were at first designated 12 and later as 10. Since all these errors could not be accounted for on the ground of miscounts on the part of the horse, it was evident that Hans is quite unable to count. The memory test was conducted in the following manner. In the absence of the questioner, a number or the name of some day of the week was spoken to the horse. The experimenter would then return and question him. Of 10 responses, 2 were correct, 8 incorrect. Among the correct answers were the number 3, a number which, as we shall see, Hans was prone to give under all sorts of conditions, and which therefore meant very little when given as a correct response. The number 2, on the other hand, was consecutively indicated by 7, 9, 5 and 3. 8 was given as 5, 6, 4, and 6 consecutively, and finally Wednesday was indicated as the 14th day of the week. After this we undertook to test the horse's far-famed knowledge of the calendar. Dates such as February 29th, November 12th, etc. were given to Hans, and he was asked to indicate on which day of the week they fell. Sunday was to be indicated by 1, Monday by 2, etc. Of 14 such tests, 10 were unsuccessful, 4 successful. But in the case of these 4, something very interesting occurred. It happened that during this series the keeper of the horse was present, and he happened to know the days on which these dates fell, as he himself testified. The dates in question were also little more than a week or so from the day of the experiment, so they could easily be determined. But as soon as we took more remote dates, both man and beast were hopelessly lost. It was certain that Hans had no knowledge of the calendar. It is needless to say anything of his supposed knowledge of cards and coins. Hans plainly was incapable of the astonishing feats of memory which had been claimed for him. Finally, we investigated Hans's musical ability. In a room adjoining the horse's stall there was a small harmonica, which spanned the once accented octave. In this one or more tones were played. The horse was required to indicate the tone played, the number of tones played, and their relation to one another. For testing his general hearing, 20 tests were given, in which the method was procedure without knowledge. Of the responses only one was correct, and that one was the tone E, for which the proper response was 3 taps, but we must bear in mind what has already been said of the number 3. The tone B was indicated by 11 taps, although Hans had only learned the scale of 1 octave and therefore could respond to only 7 tones. In the tests in which the method was procedure with knowledge, he again, without exception, was successful. Similar results were obtained in the analysis of compound clangs. In the cases of procedure without knowledge, although the experimenter here knew the correct responses, he purposely refrained from thinking of them. Not a single response was correct, while in the cases of procedure with knowledge, all but one were correct. The following were typical responses. 3 tones were played, and the question was asked how many tones were played. Hans responded at first with 4 taps, and then with 1. The tones C, E, G, A, 1, 3, 5, 6 were struck, and the question asked which tone must be eliminated to make the complex a chord. In the tests in which the method had been procedure with knowledge, this question had always been answered correctly, but when procedure was without knowledge, the responses were first 13, a tone which does not exist for Hans, then 2, a tone which was not given in the clang to be analysed, and finally 3, which was not the discordant tone. Hans's far-famed musical ability was an illusion. Taking the results of all the tests into consideration, we find that in the case of procedure with knowledge, 90 to 100% of the responses of the various series were correct, whereas in those series of procedure without knowledge, 10% at most of the responses were correct. Under the conditions prevailing during the latter tests, even these 10% must be regarded as due to chance. To be sure, Mr. Grabow, a member of the school board and an enthusiastic follower of Mr. von Osten, Zeitschrift für pädagogische Soziologie, Pathologie und Hygiene, Berlin 1904, Jahrgang 6, Heft 6, Seite 470, mentions a large number of successful tests, which was supposedly made in accordance with the method of procedure without knowledge. A thorough analysis of his experiments was not possible because the conditions under which they were conducted were not adequately specified. But I have no doubt that the successful responses of the horse were due solely to the absence of precautionary measures. I, too, could cite a number of seemingly correct responses which demonstrably were due to the absence of adequate precautionary measures. I therefore repeat, Hans can neither read, count, nor make calculations. He knows nothing of coins or cards, calendars or clocks, nor can he respond by tapping or otherwise to a number spoken to him but a moment before. Finally, he has not a trace of musical ability. After all this experimentation, it was evident that the horse was unable to work alone. but was dependent upon certain stimuli from its environment. The question therefore arose: does the horse get these stimuli while the question is being put, or during his responses, i.e. during the process of tapping? If Mr. von Osten's opinion was correct, then the process of questioning played an important part in the success of the experiment. Of course, as he said, it was not necessary to ask the question aloud. It was sufficient, curiously enough, that it be inwardly spoken, thanks to the horse's extraordinary auditory sensitivity. If, however, conditions were made such that the auditory sense was eliminated, then the animal would be unable to respond. Such a theory is not quite as absurd as it might seem at first blush, for Hansen and Lehmann have shown that an acute auditory organ is able to respond to such delicate stimulation as is involved in the softest whisper, or even in the so-called nasal whisper, in which the lips are tightly closed. They have attempted thus to explain any modes of supposed thought transference. Compare page 7. Since experts on horses agree that the horse has acute auditory sensitivity, Mr. von Osten seized upon this fact and tried to establish his theory in the following manner. No response was successfully made on the part of the horse, he said, when the sound waves caused by his, Mr. von Osten's, inner speech were deflected from the ear of the horse. This was the case when he closed nose and mouth while inwardly putting the question, or deflected the waves from the horse's ear by means of a placard held before his mouth while speaking, or finally by applying lined earmuffs to the horse's ears. If, on the other hand, he closed only his nose and not his mouth while thus inwardly putting the question, or if he held the placard so that there was a possibility of deflecting the sounds to the horse's ear, or if the earmuffs were of too sheer a material, then Hans could hear and answer the questions for which human ears were inaudible. He demonstrated all this by means of experiments, and of 20 tests of the first kind, in which auditory sensations were supposedly eliminated, 95% of the responses were incorrect. Hans would always tap too great a number, whereas of 28 tests of the second kind, not a single answer was wrong, just as had been predicted. Now, I have repeated both kinds of tests, but have always found some correct responses in those cases in which the horse supposedly was unable to hear, a thing which greatly astonished Mr. von Osten. In fact, the responses of the horse were quite as correct when I did not even whisper the question inwardly. It was quite clear that putting the question in any form whatever was wholly unnecessary. Mr. von Osten's demonstrations to the contrary, which were based upon erroneous physical principles, are to be explained as cases of vivid autosuggestion, but of this more in chapter 5. After all this experimentation, it was manifest that the cue was not given to the horse while the question was being put. It occurred, therefore, at some time during the process of tapping. But by means of which sense organ was it received by the horse? We began by examining the sense of vision, and in the following manner. Blinders were applied, and it is worthy of mention that Hans made no attempt to resist. The questioner stood to the right of the horse so that the animal knew him to be present and could hear, but not see him. Hans was required to tap a certain number. Then the experimenter would step forward into the horse's field of vision and would put the same problem again. Since, in the tests of the first kind, Hans would always make the most strenuous efforts to get a view of the questioner, and since he would rave and tear at the lines whenever the attempt was made to tie him, a thing which he had never done hitherto, it was impossible to determine in some cases whether or not he had seen the questioner during the process of tapping. I am using, therefore, in the following exposition, besides the two categories of not seen and seen, a third which I have called undecided. A total of 102 tests were made in which large blinders were used. In 35 of these the experimenter certainly was not seen. In 56 cases he was seen, and the remaining 11 are undecided. Under the first of these categories, 6% of Hans's answers were correct, i.e. only 2. Under the second head, 89% were correct, and under the third, 18% were right. In other words, the horse was at a loss the moment he was prevented from seeing the questioner, whereas his responses were nearly always correct when the experimenter was in sight. certain proof that the horse's failures are to be attributed to the elimination of visual stimuli and not to the general inconvenience occasioned by the blinders. It is evident, therefore, that the horse required certain visual stimuli or signs in order to make a correct response. Footnote. Throughout this treatise I am using the word sign or signal, whereas all other writers who have touched upon the Hans problem have always spoken of aids. Following Mr. Sandon, however, I would distinguish clearly between the two. I would designate aids all immediate stimulations of the horse's body, i.e. by means of contact, which have been designed with reference to the animal's physiological movement mechanism in such a way that they truly aid him in the production of the required movement. I would regard as signs, on the other hand, all stimulations, whether mediate or immediate, which are selected without a special regard to the anatomy or physiology of the horse, and bear no inseparable relation to the thing to be done, but are associated with it at the will of the trainer. The rider's use of reins and control by means of leg pressure and manner of sitting in the saddle, and the driver's use of the lines, all these then are aids. A simple pull at the reins, however, is not an aid but a sign. The whip may be used for giving signs as well as aids. The latter, when it does the work of the spur or of the pressure with the knees, is as the case with ladies riding horses and in lunging. All calls and all movements of the hand or head merely on the part of the trainer are to be regarded as signs. End of footnote. Such unequivocal results, however, were only obtained after we had provided blinders of sufficient size, 15 by 15 centimetres. Mr. von Osten, believing that the horse could not suffer these to be applied, had at first proposed other measures. He held a slate before his face. Some of the horse's responses were right, others wrong. The tests were repeated and were successful as long as I, myself, held the slate before my face, but not a single one of the responses was correct when another would attempt to hold the slate before me. Mr. von Osten then brought forth a kind of bolster which he fastened on the right side of the horse's face, the side which was turned towards the questioner, but this also gave uncertain results. Finally he agreed to apply blinders, but these were much too small and projected at a great angle from the head. Mr. von Osten had cut the straps, for he thought they worried the animal. The result was that only the posterior part of the horse's normal field of vision was obstructed. Therefore, one could never be quite sure whether Hans, who, it will be borne in mind, made every attempt to see the questioner, had not perhaps after all been able to peer over the edge of the blinder. The number of undecided tests, therefore, became very great. Of 108 tests, only 25 could be placed in the category of not seen, 44 in the seen, and 39, i.e. a third of the total, in the undecided. The percentage of correct answers for these three categories were, respectively, 24%, 82%, and 72%. Here we have once more approximated the same ratio between the categories of seen and not seen as in the case of the tests with the smaller blinders. If we were to count the cases which we had put under the head of undecided in the same category as those in which the vision had been excluded, as Mr. von Osten had done, then one would have been led to the conclusion that the horse did not need visual signs. Several observers had thus been led astray. E.g., General Sobel writes in the Nationalzeitung, August 28, 1904, that upon request Mr. von Osten had covered Hans's right eye by means of some sort of blinder so that he was unable to see his instructor, and that Hans did not fail to respond correctly. We evidently have here to do with the unreliable bolster mentioned above. Furthermore, Mr. Schillings made a number of tests with the small blinders, in which 50% of the answers were correct, and probably in the same manner were obtained the results published in one of the daily papers, the Berliner Tageblatt, December 12, 1904, several days after the publication of the December report, and reading as follows: Tests have been made upon Hans with blinders over his eyes, and it is to be noted that, in spite of these, he still responds correctly. Mention is also made of the experiments noted in Supplement 3, page 257, in which Mr. von Osten hid behind the questioner and merely encouraged the animal by occasional exhortations. But it is not possible to say with any degree of certainty in how far he was really hidden from the horse's view. I would add that the horse, in so far as it was at all possible to decide, never looked at the persons or the objects which he was to count, or at the words which he was to read, yet he nevertheless gave the proper responses. But he would always make the most strenuous efforts to see the questioner, see page 43. I would furthermore add that several experiments, in which Mr. von Osten and the horse were separated from each other by means of the canvas tent, failed completely, and that, on the other hand, all tests were successful in which the questioner was present in the feed room, and the door between this and the horse's stall was opened wide enough for him to be seen by the horse. I would also mention that toward evening the responses became less and less accurate. The conclusion that visual stimuli were here operative cannot be gainsaid. It is possible, to be sure, that other senses might also be involved, but it was certain that auditory sensations did not enter it. This is shown by the fact that one might remain just as silent while the horse was tapping his answer as during the putting of the question, and yet obtain a correct response. Hans, furthermore, could scarcely be distracted by auditory stimulation. If either the experimenter or anyone else present sought, at a given moment, to interrupt him by such calls as "halt," "wrong," etc., while he was going through the process of tapping, they very seldom succeeded in their attempt. Even though such interruptions did succeed in 7 out of the 21 cases in which it was tried, the assumption is well grounded that the success was due entirely, or almost entirely, to minimal movements involuntarily executed by those attempting the interruption. It is to such minimal movements that the horse, as we shall see later, promptly reacted. When the experimenter, Pfungst, himself, made the interjections, which certainly should have been more effective, we found that the horse was actually disturbed in only 2 of the 14 cases, and finally in 10 consecutive cases of attempted interruptions not a single one was successful. There was also a complete absence of any ear movement on the part of the horse, a fact in which I have been borne out by Mr. Henry Suermont, the distinguished horseback rider. Indeed, I cannot recall that Hans ever turned his ears towards me, a fact which is strikingly curious in the case of a horse so attentive and so spirited in temper. Finally, I might also mention that the breathing of the experimenter in no wise influenced the outcome of the experiment. Whether he held his breath or breathed on the leg or body of the horse made no difference. Investigations of the other senses became needless, for I had in the meantime succeeded in discovering the essential and effective signs in the course of my observations of Mr. von Osten. These signs are minimal movements of the head on the part of the experimenter. As soon as the experimenter had given a problem to the horse, he, involuntarily, bent his head and trunk slightly forward, and the horse would then put the right foot forward and begin to tap, without, however, returning it each time to its original position. As soon as the desired number of taps was given, the questioner would make a slight upward jerk of the head. Thereupon the horse would immediately swing his foot in a wide circle, bringing it back to its original position. This movement, which in the following exposition we shall designate as the back step, was never included in the count. Now after Hans had ceased tapping, the questioner would raise his head and trunk to their normal position. This second, far coarser movement was not the signal for the back step, but always followed it. But whenever this second movement was omitted, Hans, who had already brought back his foot to the original position, and had thereby put it out of commission, as it were, would give one more tap with his left foot. If it was true that these movements of the questioner guided the horse in his tapping, then the following must be shown. First, that the same movements were observed in Mr. von Osten in every case of successful response. Secondly, that they reoccurred in the same order or with only slight individual changes in the case of all who were able to obtain successful responses from the horse, and that they were absent or occurred at the wrong time in all cases of unsuccessful response. Furthermore, it was observed that it was possible to bring about unsuccessful reactions on the part of the horse as soon as the movements were voluntarily suppressed, and conversely that by voluntarily giving the necessary signs the horse might be made to respond at pleasure, so that anyone who possessed the knowledge of the proper signs could thereby gain control over the process of response on the part of the horse. These requirements have all been fulfilled, as we shall see in the following pages. With regard to the regular reoccurrence of the movements noticed in the case of Mr. von Osten, I was, after some practice, able to note carefully their peculiar characteristics. This was rather difficult, not only on account of their extreme minuteness, but also because that very vivacious gentleman made sundry accompanying movements and was constantly moving back and forth. To abstract from these the essential and really effective movements was truly difficult. It was much easier to observe these movements in the case of Mr. Schillings, probably on account of the fewer accompanying movements and perhaps on account of their greater distinctness. Usually he would raise the entire trunk a trifle, so that the movements could be noticed from behind. Besides these, I had an opportunity to observe the Count zu Castel, Mr. Rahn, and the Count Matuschka. All three made the same movement, though somewhat more minutely than Mr. Schillings, yet none as slight as those of Mr. von Osten. Footnote. During the tests, Mr. von Osten nearly always wore a slouch hat with a wide rim. The rim, of course, always moved with the head, and made the movements appear on a larger scale, in the ratio of about 3:2, as I was able to ascertain later by graphic methods. But observation was successful even at a distance of 1.5 meters when he worked with his head uncovered, and even if head and forehead were covered entirely, it was still possible to note the movements by watching the eyebrows. While Mr. Schillings and the rest of us worked with the horse, we either went bareheaded or wore only a very small cap. End of footnote. I further noticed that Count Matuschka and Mr. Schillings often showed a tendency to accompany every tap of the horse with a slight nod of the head, the last being accompanied by a more pronounced nod, and then followed by an upwards jerk of the head. In other words, they beat time with the horse. In the case of the last three mentioned, for whom the horse responded far less effectively than for Mr. von Osten or Mr. Schillings, belated or precipitate jerks would frequently occur. This was found to be true in the case of all other persons who had failed to elicit adequate responses from the horse. Often, in both cases, a complete absence of any kind of minimal movement had been noted. The accuracy of these observations in the case of Mr. von Osten is attested by Mr. Stumpf and Mr. von Hornbostel, and by these same gentlemen and Professor F. Schumann in the case of Mr. Schillings and myself. They also found these movements to be most minute in the case of Mr. von Osten. In my case they also pronounced them minimal and often quite imperceptible. All other persons who have seen me work with the horse, but who were not familiar with the nature of these movements, never perceived them, no matter how closely they observed me. Since the doubt was expressed that these movements did not precede but followed closely upon the back step of the horse, i.e. that an error with regard to the time element was involved, it became important that time measurements be taken. This was done in the following manner. The questioner asked the horse to tap numbers from 5 to 20, seldom higher. He purposely refrained from pronouncing the number, but recorded it after every test had been completed. This was a matter of indifference to the horse, see page 42, and had the advantage that the measurement was not influenced by the knowledge on the part of the timekeeper. 2 observers were required, one watching the horse, the other the questioner. Both observers had 5th second stopwatches. The larger face of this watch shows the 5th second, and a hand on the smaller face indicates the minute. By pressing upon the stem the watch may be set in motion at any moment desired, and by pressing it once more it may be instantly stopped, and the time elapsing between the setting in motion and the stopping may be read on the face. By pressing upon the stem a third time, the hands are brought back to 0, and the watch is ready for another test. At a moment agreed upon beforehand, usually the third tap of the horse, both observers started their watches. Practice tests had shown that this could be done with all the accuracy necessary in this case. As soon as the observer of the questioner noticed the latter's head movement, he stopped his watch, and as soon as the observer of the horse noticed the latter's back step, he stopped his watch. Since the movement of the horse's foot does not occur as a jerk, but is of greater extent than a jerk would be, it was agreed that the observer was to stop the watch as soon as he recognized the back step as such, not when the foot was being raised from the ground, because it was not then evident whether the horse would bring it back to the original position or whether he was preparing to give another tap, nor when he had brought his foot completely back, but at the moment in which it was evident that the horse intended to make the back step. Experimentation had shown that an agreement as to this moment was possible. A tap with the left foot, which might possibly follow upon the back step, could be left out of account. The difference in time between the two watches would show the time between the head jerk of the questioner and the back step of the horse. Footnote. For the benefit of those who are familiar with reaction time experiments of this kind, I would state the following. The reaction to the head jerk, on account of the minuteness of the latter, was sensory throughout, and therefore all precipitate reactions are entirely wanting. The reaction to the back step was, like the preceding one, a reaction to a visual cue. Hans's tapping was almost quite inaudible. Both stopwatches were carefully regulated, in order to eliminate also the constant error which might possibly arise as a result of some difference in the functioning of their pressure mechanism. The two watches were always exchanged in the different series of tests, by the observer of the man and the observer of the horse. The two time measurements obtained by the two observers contained, of course, the reaction times of the observers themselves. In order to equalize the constant error which thereby arose, it was arranged that each observer should react alternately now to the man, now to the horse. In order to be perfectly safe, the reaction times of those concerned, von Hornbostel, Pfungst, Schumann and Stumpf, were later determined in the laboratory by means of the carefully regulated hip chronoscope. Separate determinations were made of the reactions to the head jerk and to an imitation of the horse's back step. Then the time which one observer took to react upon a head jerk was compared to the reaction times of the other observers to the back step. Since the greatest difference which was found in this comparison did not exceed 1/10 second, the results obtained in the courtyard required no correction. End of footnote. And if the back step was indeed a reaction upon the head jerk, then the watches would have to show a later time for the back step than for the head jerk. Measurements of this kind were taken for Mr. von Osten, Mr. Schillings and myself. In the case of the first two, it was taken without any knowledge on their part. They did not even know that they were being observed, having been told that the measurements were for the sake of determining the horse's rate. In my case, to be sure, the time could not be taken without my knowledge. I succeeded, however, in eliminating the effect of this knowledge on my part. Compare pages 88 and 145. Since the results obtained in the case of Mr. Schillings quite agree with those obtained in my case, it is evident they may be considered as being of equal value. With regard to the number of tests, the following table may be referred to. The first vertical column gives the name of the questioner, i.e. the person operating with the horse. The four other columns give the number of tests made upon each of these. The name of the person who made the observation in each series is indicated at the head of the column. It is unnecessary to give the name of the observer of the horse, for the only difficulty lay in the observation of the questioner. The numerals 1 and 2 indicate two series taken at different times. Questioner, von Osten, von Hornbostel, 1, 9, 2, 15. Pfungst, 1, 34, 2, 17. Stumpf, 1, 8, 2, 27. Questioner, Schillings. Pfungst, 1, 19, 2, 17. Schumann, 1, 6, 2, 16. Questioner, Pfungst. Von Hornbostel, 1, 6, 2, 13. Stumpf, 1, 9. We have omitted from this table several tests in which the observer of the questioner noticed no head jerks whatever, and therefore could not arrest his stopwatch. although the horse responded correctly. 4 tests of this kind were made by Mr. von Hornbostel, 2 by Mr. Pfungst, 2 by Mr. Schumann, and 5 by Mr. Stump. In the case of Mr. Pfungst, the horse gave the unusually high number of 50 taps. The attention of the observer had been taxed too long and had failed him. 2 seconds is the most favourable time. The head jerk of Mr. von Osten evidently occurred during a lapse in Mr. Pfungst's attention and therefore remained unnoticed. Questioner: von Osten, von Hornbostel, 1. Right 44%, wrong 56%. 2. Right 60%, wrong 20%. Pfungst: 1. Right 62%, wrong 12%. 2. Right 88%, wrong 0%. Stump: 1. Right 0%, wrong 100%. 2. Right 48%, wrong 22%. Questioner: Pfungst, von Hornbostel, 1. Right 100%, wrong 0%. 2. Right 92%, wrong 0%. Stump: 1. Right 100%, wrong 0%. Questioner: Shillings. Pfungst: 1. Right 74%, wrong 5%. 2. Right 100%, wrong 0%. Schumann: 1. Right 83%, wrong 17%. 2. Right 100%, wrong 0%. The results of the experiments are given in the second table. The general arrangement corresponds to that of the first table. Even though the absolute number of tests was smaller, yet for the sake of giving a better general view, all values are given in percentages. The tests in which the movement of the questioner had preceded that of the horse, as had been anticipated, were recorded under R, right. Under W, wrong, we have recorded those cases in which the testimony of the stopwatches, contrary to our expectation, indicated that the reverse order prevailed. Finally, those cases which would complete the 100%, i.e. those in which the watches indicate simultaneity of the movements in question, are not recorded. From this table we may note the following. The time measurements for Mr. Shillings and Mr. Pfungst are quite in agreement and go to show that the order in time of the head movement of the questioner and the back step of the horse was exactly what had been expected. The few contradictory cases which occur in series 1 of the observations upon Mr. Shillings are to be accounted for by the fact that he was here for the first time the subject of observation, whereas the recorded time measurements in the case of Mr. Pfungst had been preceded by a number of practice tests. The results of the measurements taken in the case of Mr. von Osten were far less satisfactory. Even if one were to allow a series containing barely more than 50% of right cases as sufficient proof of the correctness of our expectation regarding the order of the movements of the questioner and the horse, only 3 of the 6 series obtained with Mr. von Osten as subject would satisfy this expectation. However, since 4 of the 6 series show a greater number of cases of simultaneity, the percentage may easily be deduced by referring to the percent of right and wrong cases. The proposed method would give a distorted view, and therefore it appears that the more correct method would be to consider simply the numerical ratio of the right and wrong cases. Since, furthermore, Series 2 shows, in every case, a decided change which is similar for all observers, note especially Pfungst, there can be no doubt but that practice is here involved, and that Series 2 is to be regarded as the true standard. Throughout this series we find a preponderance of right cases. Therefore the table unmistakably confirms the expected order in time. That there were more wrong cases with Mr. von Osten as subject than with the other questioners is to be explained by the fact that the decisive movements were far less easily observed in this case than in that of the other questioners. See page 49. We expect that Series 3 would show the same result, or approximately the same results in the case of Mr. von Osten that it did for Mr. Pfungst and Mr. Schillings, but unfortunately he declines to act as subject. In the meantime, however, new and decisive proof presented itself which destroyed all possible doubt. Before adverting to it, let us consider in a few words the reaction time of the horse, the time elapsing between the final sign of the questioner and the reaction of the horse, i.e. the back step. Unfortunately, this time cannot be directly determined. All that can be ascertained from our time measurement is that the time intervening between the moment of the head jerk and the moment in which the reaction of the horse is noted, see page 51. This time averaged, for the 127 measurements, 0.45 seconds. If we stated the unavoidable error obtained on the basis of extended supplementary measurements, which it is not necessary to consider here, as 0.15 seconds, and apply it to the value found, we obtain 0.3 seconds as the probable reaction time of the horse. Footnote. See page 126 on the corresponding reaction time in the case of man. Similar tests have been made in the case of animals in only one instance, and that for dogs, by E. W. Weyer, but, as might have been expected, they did not yield any satisfactory results. End of footnote. That the tapping, as well as all other movements of the horse, was nothing other than a reaction upon certain visual stimuli, was proved beyond a doubt by the fact that the voluntary execution of the head jerk and of other movements, which we will describe in more detail later on, brought about all the proper responses on the part of the horse. Thus, artificial synthesis became the test of the correctness of analytical observation. To elucidate, if the questioner retains the erect position he elicited no response from the horse, say what he would. If, however, he stooped over slightly, Hans would immediately begin to tap, whether or not he had been asked a question. It seems almost ridiculous that this should never have been noticed before, but it is easily understood, for as soon as the questioner gave the problem, he bent forward, be it ever so slightly, in order to observe the horse's foot more closely, for the foot was the horse's organ of speech. Hans would invariably begin to tap when I stooped to jot some note I wished to make. Even to lower the head a little was sufficient to elicit a response, even though the body itself might remain completely erect. Of 30 tests made in this position, 29 were successful. Hans would continue to tap until the questioner again resumed a completely erect posture. If, for instance, I stooped forwards after having told the horse to tap 13, and if I purposely remained in this position until I had counted 20, he would, without any hesitation, tap 20. If I asked him to add 3 and 4 but did not move until 14 was reached, he would tap 14. 26 such tests gave similar results. The reaction of the horse upon such a signal for stopping showed slight modifications according to the time which elapsed between the last tap and the signal for stopping. These modifications, which had hitherto been paraded as expressions of the horse's psychical power, may be illustrated by the following schematic figures, figures 1 to 4. In all of them, the dotted line CD represents the ground level. D shows where the horse's right forefoot was located before he began tapping. A and C, respectively, indicate the position to which the foot is lowered during the process of tapping. The unbroken line gives the direction of the back step. If Hans, having raised his foot from A to B, preparatory to tapping, receives the signal at or just before the moment he lowers the foot, he immediately swings it in a wide circle from C back to its original position at D, figure 1. As a matter of fact, A and C coincide but are juxtaposed in the diagram for the sake of schematic unity. This was the usual form of the back step. If the signal for stopping is given a little after the last tap, figure 2, i.e. at the time that the foot is already being raised for another tap, then the back step occurs as ABD. The horse thus gives, at the moment it receives the signal for stopping, a changed impulse to the moving foot. The curve, therefore, has a kink at B, and the back step occurs with seeming hesitancy. Hans appears not quite certain of his result. If the signal be given somewhat later still, figure 3, i.e. when the foot is being lowered to complete a tap, Hans is still able to put on the brakes, as it were, and draw back his foot before it reaches the ground. The whole process gives the impression that the horse was just about to make a mistake of 1 unit, but at the last moment had bethought himself of the correct answer. Finally, if the signal be deferred still longer, it becomes impossible to prevent the extra tap. The back step again has the same form as in figure 1. Hans has made a mistake in his answer by 1 unit too many. Conversely, if the head jerk of the questioner occurs too soon, i.e. at the moment the horse has raised his foot for the final tap to the height B, figure 4, then the tap is not completed, but the foot, without touching the ground, makes the curve B, C2, D back to its original position. Hans has again made a mistake in his answer, this time by 1 unit too few. All these variations go to show one thing. Hans never knows in advance which tap is to be the final one. These variations in his reactions occur often without having been intended by the questioner, but to bring them about at will requires skill, on account of the shortness of the time involved in the reaction. End of section 3.
Section 4 of Chapter 2, Experiments and Observations, Part 2. Whenever the signal for stopping, which we have just discussed, was followed by the complete erection of the head and trunk, Hans would definitely cease tapping. If, however, the questioner failed to assume a completely erect position, or if he stooped forward ever so slightly, the horse would follow the back step of the right foot with an extra tap of the left foot. Besides occurring in tests in which Mr. von Osten assumed the role of questioner, this fact was also noted when the Count zu Castell and Mr. Schillings acted as subjects. Since the extra tap just mentioned was not given like the others with the right foot forward, but with the left foot upon the spot, it was possible for the horse to execute it with a greater show of energy. This simulated a high degree of mental certainty on the part of the horse, as if he wished to indicate that this was the correct solution of the problem and it would have to stand. In spite of all this, many errors would creep in. It was possible to prolong this extra tap, and thus make it appear more dilatory. We need hardly add that henceforth it was within the power of the experimenter to have the tapping executed entirely with the right foot, or with the final extra tap of the left foot. Hitherto the view had been current that this lay solely within the pleasure of the horse. If the questioner still inclined forward, still remained in the bent position after Hans had given the final tap with his left foot, the horse would immediately begin to tap once more with his right foot, which had in the meantime become ready for further action. If the head jerk was then made, Hans would bring his right foot back, give the extra tap with his left foot, then resume tapping with the right, and thus continue until the questioner once more resumed the erect posture. Thus the horse on one occasion, when I wished him to tap 100, gave, contrary to my desire, the following response: 39 with the right foot, 1 with the left, 24 with the right, 1 with the left, 35 with the right, and 1 with the left. Later, it became possible for me to cause him to tap 1 right, 1 left, 1 right, 1 left, etc. I could even get him to tap exclusively with the left foot by standing at his left rather than at his right, as had been customary with his questioners. These taps with the left foot were executed in a far less elegant fashion than those with the right foot, and with a great waste of energy. Hans had become a right-handed individual, as it were, as a result of long habits. With regard to the distance at which the experimenter directed the horse, the following may be said. The usual distance was 1/4 to 1/2 metre. This holds for all tests hitherto described. 70 tests which were made for the purpose of discovering the influence of change in distance show that the reaction of the horse upon the customary signal of the head jerk was accurate up to a distance of 3 1/2 metres. At a distance of 3 1/2 to 4 metres, there suddenly occurred a fall of 60 to 70% in the number of correct responses. At a distance of 4 to 4 1/2 metres, only 1/3 of the responses were correct, and at a distance beyond 4 1/2 metres, there were no correct responses. The greater number of these tests were made in our presence by Mr. von Osten, who was under the impression that we were testing the accuracy of the horse's hearing, whereas we were really testing the accuracy of his perception of movements. With regard to the different positions which the experimenter might assume with reference to the horse, the following may be noted. The normal position was to the right of the horse. If the experimenter stood immediately in front of Hans, The latter's reaction would be just as accurate, though he would always turn his head and make desperate efforts to see the questioner, even though he was held in short by the reins. When a position immediately behind the horse was taken, a somewhat dangerous proceeding, since Hans would at once begin to kick, no response could be obtained until he succeeded in turning far enough around to get the questioner within view. If he was restrained from turning completely around, he would at least turn his head, and always to the right. One might even turn his back upon Hans during the tests, for the signal for stopping was not obtained from the face of the questioner, but from a movement of the head. The following incident will show to what extent the horse had become accustomed to seeing the questioner in a certain definite position. For a long time I had been in the habit, without exception, of standing close to the horse's shoulder. Mr. von Osten, on the other hand, would stand farther back. When on a certain day I assumed the latter position, the horse would not suffer it, but would move backwards until it had its accustomed view of me. Finally, we sought to discover by what movements the horse could be made to cease tapping. We discovered that upward movements served as signals for stopping. The raising of the head was the most effective, though the raising of the eyebrows or the dilation of the nostrils, as in a sneer, seemed also to be efficacious. However, it was impossible for me to discover whether or not these latter movements were accompanied by some slight involuntary upward movement of the head. The upward movement of the head was ineffective only when it did not occur as a jerk, but was executed in a circuitous form, first upward and then back again. Such a movement was occasionally observed in the case of Mr. von Osten. The elevation of the arms or of the elbow nearest the horse, or the elevation of the entire body, was also effective. Even if a placard, with which the experimenter tried to cover his face, were raised at a given moment, the horse would make the back step. On the other hand, head movements to the right and to the left, or forward and back, in fine, all horizontal movements, remained ineffective. We also found that all hand movements, including the wonderfully effective thrust of the hand into the pocket filled with carrots, brought no response. I might also change my position and walk forward and then backward some distance behind the horse, but the back step would only occur in response to the characteristic stimulus. After what has been said, it is easy to understand how vain were Mr. Schillings's attempts to disturb the horse, and how naturally he might conclude that Hans was not influenced by visual signs. Mr. Schillings simply did not know which signs were effective. While the horse could thus be interrupted in the process of tapping by movements which were executed at the level of the questioner's head, yet movements below this level had the opposite effect. If Hans showed that he was about to cease tapping before it was desired, it was possible to cause him to continue by simply bending forward a trifle more. The greater angle at which the questioner's trunk was now inclined caused the horse to increase the rate of tapping. The rule may be stated thus: the greater the angle at which the body inclined forward, the greater the horse's rate of tapping, and vice versa. It was noticeable that whenever Mr. von Osten asked for a relatively large number, in which case he always bent farther forward than in the case of small numbers, Hans would immediately begin to tap very swiftly. Not being entirely satisfied with these observations, the following more exact measurements were taken. I asked the horse to tap 20. From 1 to 10 I held my body at a certain constant angle. At 10 I suddenly bent farther forward and retained this posture until 20 had been reached. If there existed a relationship between the angle of inclination and the rate of tapping, then the time for the last 10 taps ought to be less than for the first 10. Of 34 such tests, 31 were successful. The following are 2 specimen series. The first series consisted of 10 tests of 15 taps each. In all cases my head was bent at an angle of 30 degrees to the axis of the trunk, but I constantly changed the angle of inclination of the trunk. It was not possible to measure this angle accurately on account of the rapidity with which the whole test had to be made. I was able, however, to differentiate between them with enough accuracy to designate the smallest angle, about 20 degrees, as belonging to grade 1, and the greatest angle, about 100 degrees, as belonging to grade 7. By fixing certain points in the environment, it was possible to get approximately the same angle repeatedly. The time from the 3rd to the 13th tap was, in all cases, taken by Professor Stumpf by means of a stopwatch. The tests were taken in the following order. Grade of inclination, 1. Time for 10 taps, 5.2 seconds. Grade of inclination, 6. Time for 10 taps, 4.6 seconds. Grade of inclination, 2. Time for 10 taps, 5 seconds. Grade of inclination, 2. Time for 10 taps, 5 seconds. Grade of inclination, 4. Time for 10 taps, 4.8 seconds. Grade of inclination, 5. Time for 10 taps, 4.8 seconds. Grade of inclination, 6. Time for 10 taps, 4.6 seconds. Grade of inclination, 7. Time for 10 taps, 4.4 seconds. From this series, it will be seen that in the case that the same angle of inclination, 2 and 6 were repeated, and 3 was omitted, the same rate obtained in the tapping. In 2 other tests, I constantly increased the angle of inclination during the 15 taps, and Hans gradually increased the rate of tapping accordingly. In the second series, I had the horse tap 14 5 times. I myself took the time of the taps up to 7 by means of the stopwatch, while Professor Stumpf took the time of the taps from 8 to 13. At 8 I suddenly bent forward a little more and retained this position until tap 13. The results were as follows. Taps 2 to 7, Pfungst, 3.2 seconds. Taps 8 to 13, Stumpf, 2.6 seconds. Taps 2 to 7, 2.2 to 2.4 seconds. Taps 8 to 13, 2 seconds. Taps 2 to 7, 2.4 seconds. Taps 8 to 13, 2 seconds. Taps 2 to 7, 2.2 to 2.4 seconds. Taps 8 to 13, 2.2 seconds. Taps 2 to 7, 2.4 seconds. Taps 8 to 13, 2.2 seconds. Such good results, however, were possible only after a number of preliminary practice tests had been made. The experiment was especially difficult because the horse was often on the point of stopping in the midst of a test. This was probably due to some unintentional movement on my part. In such cases, I could induce him to continue tapping only by bending forward still more, but this effected also, as we have seen, an increase in his rate of tapping. Such tests, of course, could not give unambiguous results. The rate of tapping was quite independent of my rate of counting. Thus, if I counted aloud rapidly, but bent forward only very slightly, the horse's tapping was slow and lagged behind my count. If I counted slowly but bent far forward, Hans would tap rapidly and advance beyond my count. Thus we see that his rate of tapping was in accordance with the degree of inclination of my body and never in accordance with the rate of my counting, i.e., it was quite independent of every sort of auditory stimulation. Direct observation and a comparison of the records of the time Hans required in giving to his master responses involving small, medium and large numbers with the records of the time which he required to respond to my questions when I bent only slightly, moderately or very far forward, proved that the increased rapidity in tapping in the case of large numbers, which many regarded as evidence of high intelligence, see page 20, was, as a matter of fact, brought about in the way described. The 2 series, in each of which the time measured was for 10 taps, are quite in accord. The horse did not tap faster because he had been given a large number by Mr. von Osten, but because the latter had bent farther forwards. From all this, it readily appears why it was possible to cause Hans to increase his rate of tapping, but not to decrease it. To do the latter would involve a decrease in the angle of inclination of the body. This would necessitate the erection of the body. As we have seen, this was the signal to which Hans reacted by ceasing to tap. And as a matter of fact, we never knew the horse to decrease his rate of tapping in the course of any single test, except in the case of very large numbers, and then it was probably due to fatigue. Mr. von Osten insisted that Hans often slowed down towards the end of a test in order to obviate mistakes, but all the tests in which he tried to demonstrate this to us were unsuccessful. In spite of all exhortation, Hans would tap either uniformly or somewhat more rapidly as soon as his master, in all probability unconsciously, bent somewhat lower. Only once was such a test successful. Mr. von Osten, upon our request, asked the horse to give a certain large number. In this instance, the decrease in the rate of tapping was due to fatigue and had nothing whatever to do with the desire on the part of the horse to avoid error. Furthermore, Mr. Rahn, who had visited Hans 20 times and had made careful notes of his observations, corroborated my statement when he said that he himself never noted the decrease in rate mentioned. Contrary statements may perhaps be due to the fact that the tense state of expectancy on the part of the observer made the interval between the last taps appear subjectively somewhat longer. So much for the technique of the tapping. Now a word about the numbers which Hans tapped. I refer only to the results obtained in series which involved no volitional control. The number 1 was very difficult to get. Hans usually tapped 2 instead. Thus, even in the case of Mr. von Osten, he responded 5 times with 2, and only in the 6th test did he react correctly. As far as other questioners were concerned, 1 was seldom ever obtained, except in the case of Mr. Schillings and myself. The numbers 2, 3, and 4, on the other hand, were very easily obtained, and, above all, 3 seldom failed. 3 seemed to be the horse's favourite number, and was very frequently given instead of other numbers. Thus, 1/6 of all the horse's incorrect responses which were given to me were in terms of the number 3. The numbers 5 and 6 were a little more difficult to obtain, and above 10 the difficulty increased rapidly. Indeed, I never saw Hans respond with a number exceeding 20 to any questioner, Mr. Schillings or Mr. von Osten excepted. I saw the 9 vain attempts of Count zu Castel to get the number 15, and Count Matuschka's 8 unsuccessful attempts to obtain the number 16 as a response. But even with Mr. von Osten and Mr. Schillings, such failures were not infrequent. Thus, Mr. von Osten tried 5 consecutive times to obtain the number 24. I myself did not fare any better at first. But the following table shows what practice can do. If we compare the percent of correct responses involving the numbers 1 to 7, for which alone I have sufficient material, namely 80 to 100 cases, obtained in the first half of our tests, with that of the second half, we get the following. For number 1, in first half of tests 49%, in second half of tests 92%. For number 2, in first half of tests 92%, in second half of tests 95%. For number 3, in first half of tests 89%, in second half of tests 92%. For number 4, in first half of tests 86%, in second half of tests 98%. For number 5, in first half of tests 74%, in second half of tests 97%. For number 6, in first half of tests 62%, in second half of tests 86%. For number 7, in first half of tests 53%, in second half of tests 96%. From this we see how hard it was at first to get the number 1, and that failure was as frequent as success, and how much easier it was on the other hand to get the numbers 2 and 3, and which therefore do not show any great improvement in the second half of the tests. Beyond the 3, the percentage of correct responses decreased, and the number 7 stood at the same level as the number 1. In the second half of the tests, all these differences disappeared, and errors were infrequent and seldom exceeded +1 or -1. These results of practice are not to be credited to the horse, but to the experimenter, who was at first quite unskilled. This difference in results does not appear in the case of Mr. von Osten, for his initial practice had been many years previous. The values obtained in his case were very constant throughout our experimentation and generally showed something like 90% of correct responses. To be sure, in his case also the number 1 was somewhat unfavourable, 79% were correct responses, but the percentages obtained in his case showed no improvement whatever throughout our experimentation. We need scarcely add that with the voluntary control of the giving of the signs, in the case at least of such small numbers as here discussed, no errors whatever occurred. We have discussed the influence of the experimenter, i.e. the one who asked the horse to tap. Now let us consider the influence of others present upon the horse. As a general rule, other persons had no effect upon the horse's responses. This appears from the failure of nearly all tests in which all of those present, with the exception of the questioner himself, knew the number which the horse was to tap. Even when the others concentrated their whole attention upon the number, it profited little, as a close analysis of the 136 cases which belong under this head in our records go to prove. Thus, in the presence of a group of 20 interested persons, during the absence of Mr. von Osten, 21 problems were given to the horse, the solutions of which were known to everyone but the questioner. Result: only 2 correct responses. Only when there was among the spectators someone to whom the horse was accustomed to respond, or one from whom he regularly received his food, would such an influence be effective. Footnotes. Mr. Schillings, however, did succeed in making a number of tests with the cooperation of others who had never before worked with the horse. These tests were made under the following conditions. The horse was standing in his stall, when Mr. Schillings and another gentleman approached him. There was no one else present. Mr. Schillings, who tried to remain as passive inwardly as possible, asked his partner to think consecutively of different numbers between 1 and 20, which thus were known to him alone. Hans was then commanded by Mr. Schillings to tap the numbers, which he did to the great astonishment of the men, and especially of Mr. Schillings. In like manner, Mr. Sander, a staff physician in the Marine, received, so he writes me, 3 correct responses to 4 questions which he put to the horse. It happened also in the case of 2 scientific men, and finally, 2, in my own case when I first came in contact with the horse. See page 88. The horse's reaction was brought about in the same way in every one of these instances. Mr. Schillings, in bending forward slightly, thereby started the horse a-tapping, and his companion, just as innocently, interrupted the process by means of a movement of his head when the right number of taps was reached. I later tried similar experiments together with Mr. Rahn. I was aware of the answer to the riddle at the time, but he was not. Mr. Rahn stepped in front of the horse and thought intently of certain numbers. I did the questioning, that is, I got the horse to tap. In 12 tests, Hans responded correctly in only 2 instances. In the 10 others, he always tapped beyond the number Mr. Rahn had in mind, e.g. 21 instead of 2, and was evidently awaiting a movement on my part. When we exchanged roles, Mr. Rahn doing the questioning and I doing the thinking, the horse would not respond at all, although as a rule Mr. Rahn had been fairly successful in working with him alone. I had gradually gained so much influence over the horse that he would scarcely tend to anyone else when I was about, Mr. von Osten hardly excepted. In this connection I would prefer to avoid the term rapport, which may rise in the minds of many, since it has been used so much in connection with the phenomena of hypnotism, for I would not obscure a fact that is clear by giving it a name that is vague. End of footnotes. But such cases were few. The most important were the following. I at one time whispered a number to Hans, on the occasion of the tests mentioned on page 37, and Mr. von Osten asked for it the moment I stepped aside. Hans answered incorrectly, even though I stood close behind Mr. von Osten. I did not, however, think intently of the number. As soon as I concentrated my attention upon the number, he promptly responded correctly. Further cases are those mentioned on page 38, in which the keeper of the horse unintentionally aided in giving 4 dates which were unknown to all others present, including the questioner. This single instance shows the necessity of the rule that during tests in which the method is that of procedure without knowledge, the solutions should be known to no one of those present. Finally, the tests made by the September Commission and reported in Supplement 3, page 255, may possibly belong under this head. Since they were not followed out any further, I am unable to render a definite judgment upon them. In most of these tests the question itself, as put by Mr. von Osten, was not adequately answered, but curiously enough, however, the number which had been given to Hans in Mr. von Osten's absence, and which formed the initial number of some mathematical operation, was tapped correctly. This may possibly be explained by the assumption that this initial number had been retained in the memory of some of those present, see page 149 on the perseverative tendency, and that the horse, since he had been working with some of them, responded to one of those present. Chance may have played some part also. If the questioner knew the number of taps desired, which was not the case in the tests hitherto discussed, then the environment had still less influence upon the horse, except that it caused occasional interruption. The horse's responses, therefore, did not tend to become more successful just because a number of persons were simultaneously concentrating upon the result desired. This was proven by the experiments which were repeatedly made for this purpose. Only one person at a time had any influence upon Hans. If two questioners tried to influence the horse at the same time, other conditions being the same, success would be for the one who had the greater control over the animal when working alone with him. Professor Stumpf and I made the following experiment. Both of us stood to the right of the horse, each thinking of a number. In 10 such tests, Hans always tapped my number. When Stumpf concentrated upon 5 and I upon 8, the horse responded with 8, i.e. the larger number. When Stumpf had 7 in mind and I had 4, the response would be 4, i.e. the smaller number. When Stumpf thought of number 6 and I had fixed upon none, Hans tapped 35. He was evidently awaiting my signal. When I went away, Stumpf again demanded the number 6 and the horse responded properly. When I returned, Stumpf's attempts again failed. On another occasion, Count Matushka put a number of questions, while Mr. von Osten stood behind him. All of the horse's responses were correct, even the one answering the question, how much is 7 times 7, which was difficult on account of the great number of taps required. I was able to note from the direction of the horse's eyes that he was attending only to his master and not to the Count. On still another occasion, Mr. Grabow sang 2 tones, the second being the fourth of the first, and asked Hans, how many intervals lie between? I was standing erect before the horse and was thinking intently of the number 2, but without giving any voluntary sign of any sort. Hans tapped 2, whereupon Mr. Grabow put a number of similar questions, but I no longer thought of the answers, and all of Hans's responses were wrong. Although Hans was not influenced by others so long as a suitable experimenter was present, yet he might be disturbed and under certain conditions might be led to make the back step in response to certain movements in his environment. The person to whom he responded would have to be close to the experimenter and would necessarily have to execute a movement greater in extent than the experimenter's. In such instances, the raising of the head, arm, or trunk was a sufficient stimulus. Thus we made the following 2 series of tests. Mr. Stumpf stood with trunk bent forward before the horse, and at a moment decided upon beforehand, assumed an erect position. I myself stood beside Hans and asked him to tap. When I stood at the horse's neck, then Mr. Stumpf's interruption was effective. When I stood at the horse's flank, the interruption affected only a seeming hesitation, and when I moved still farther back, the horse continued to tap despite any attempted disturbance. In the second series, the questioner remained constantly at the right shoulder of the horse, while the one who attempted to distract him changed positions. When the latter stood to the right, immediately in front of or beside the questioner, the disturbance was effective in 10 out of 13 cases, but when he stood back of and to the right of the questioner, the attempts at disturbance were seldom successful. If he chose a place before or to the left of the horse, there was hardly any distraction, in 4 cases only out of 13, and if he stood to the left and behind the animal, he exerted no influence whatever. Hans manifestly turned his attention, almost exclusively, to the side at which the questioner stood. That knowledge of this modus operandi made it possible for those persons to get responses from the horse who had hitherto been unsuccessful, is shown in the case of Mr. Stumpf, when he began to control his movements voluntarily on the basis of observations which had been made. 2. Problems which Hans solved by movements of the head. We are here concerned with the horse's head movements upwards, downwards, to the right, and to the left, and also with nodding and shaking of the head to signify yes and no. We soon discovered that these experiments also were successful without an oral statement of the problem. In other words, the auditory stimulus was quite superfluous. The tests with the blinders showed that Hans was lost as soon as his questioner was out of his view, but responded adequately the moment the questioner was in sight. Hans therefore had established no idea of any sort in connection with the terms up, down, etc., but in these cases likewise he reacted in response to certain visual stimuli. The nature of these stimuli I discovered at first in my observations of Mr. von Osten, and also of myself when working with the horse. Above all things it was necessary that the questioner during these tests should stand perfectly erect. If he stooped ever so slightly, the test was unsuccessful. If he carefully refrained from any movement whatsoever, and looking straight before him asked the horse which direction is right, or which direction is upward, Hans would execute all sorts of head movements without rhyme or reason. It was evident that he noted that a head movement of some kind was expected of him, but he did not know the particular one that was wanted. But if the questioner now raised his head, Hans would begin to nod, and would continue doing so until the questioner lowered his head. This reaction was interpreted as signifying yes. Mr. von Osten had always asked Hans before each of the more difficult tests whether he had comprehended the meaning of the problem, and was reassured only upon seeing the horse's affirmative response. But contrary to Mr. von Osten's expectation, Hans also responded in this manner after a pair of ear caps had been drawn over his ears. In the case of the tests described at the beginning of the chapter, in which the method was that of procedure without knowledge, Mr. von Osten had always insisted that we await Hans's nod of comprehension before proceeding. We complied, Hans nodded, and regularly disgraced himself. When the questioner raised his head somewhat higher than normal, Hans would throw his own upward, which was supposed to signify upward. A lowering of the head on the part of the questioner was followed by a lowering on the part of Hans, which was his form of response for down. For some time I was in a quandary as to the difference between the questioner's signal for this latter response and the one which was the signal for the horse to begin tapping, although I had often given both kinds unwittingly. Further experiments showed that Hans responded with a nod of the head whenever the questioner, while bending forward, chanced to stand in front of or to the side of the horse's head, but that he would begin to tap in response to the same signal as soon as the experimenter stood farther back. The difference in the two signals, therefore, was very slight, and I repeatedly noted that instead of tapping, as he had been requested, Hans would respond to the Count zu Castell's and Mr. Schillings's questions by a nod of the head. If, while standing in the customary position to the right of and facing the horse, the questioner would turn his head a little to the right, a movement which, when seen from the horse's position, would appear to be to the left, Hans would turn his head to his left. But if, on the other hand, the questioner would turn slightly to the left, i.e. seen from the horse's position to the right, then Hans would turn his head to his right. And finally, whenever the questioner turned his head first to the right, then to the left, Hans would respond by turning first to his left, then to his right. This, according to Mr. von Osten, signified 0 or no. Since this movement could not be executed by the experimenter while in a stooping position, it can now readily be seen why it was that Hans, instead of shaking his head, always began to tap whenever a placard with 0 upon it was shown to him in the course of experiments in which the method was procedure without knowledge on the part of the questioner. The latter expected the horse to tap, and therefore bent forwards. Like all the horse's other forms of response, this, too, was always unsuccessful whenever the questioner stepped behind the animal. Although Hans had always responded to Mr. von Osten and Mr. Schillings, and at first also to me, by means of the stereotyped movement of the head to the right and then to the left to signify 0 or no, I later succeeded in controlling my signals so as to get the inverted order in the horse's response. In the case of Mr. Schillings and of Mr. von Osten, all of the movements just described were very minute, and long after the movements, which were effective stimuli for releasing the process of tapping, were recognized, it was still exceedingly difficult to discover them in these two gentlemen. The signal for 0 and no was relatively the most pronounced of the group in the case of Mr. von Osten, while with Mr. Schillings it was the least pronounced, in comparison with his very strong jerk. Yet in both cases Hans responded with absolute certainty. It is now readily conceivable how it was possible to make the horse respond to all sorts of foolish questions, both by involuntary signs, i.e. expressions following upon the bare imaging of the response expected, as well as by means of controlled signs. One could thus obtain consecutively the answers yes and no to the same question. Or one might ask, Hans, where is your head? And Hans would bend to the earth. And where are your legs? He would look at the sky, etc. Let us examine for a moment the directives which the horse required for the various positions. If one called him while he was running about the courtyard, he paid no attention whatever, but if one beckoned to him, he came immediately. A raising of the hand brought him to a standstill. If one now stepped forward or pointed one's hand in that direction, he would step forward, or vice versa, he would step backwards. By means of minimal movement of the head, of the arm nearest the horse, or of the whole body, Hans could be induced to assume the position one desired without touching him or speaking a word. I noticed this quite early in the course of the investigation. Once, when intending to ask the horse to step backwards to the right, I inadvertently said, "Step backwards to the left," whereupon he stepped backwards to the right. In spite of my verbal error, I had involuntarily given him the proper directives. Finally, we may note that Mr. Van Osten had occasionally asked the horse to jump or to rear. The command in this case was jump, or the question was, what do horses do in the circus? Since these tests were just as effective when the command was given silently, it was an indication that these, too, depended upon visual stimuli. What was necessary to cause the horse to step backward and then jump forward was to step backward oneself, or make a slight movement of the hand in that direction. If one wished to make him rear, it might be effected by throwing the arm or head slightly upward. 3. Problems which Hans solved by approaching the objects to be designated. The method pursued in these tests was the following. From 5 to 8 pieces of coloured cloth, half by 1/4 meters in size, were arranged in changing series upon the ground, the interval between them being equal to the width of one piece, or else they were hung upon a string a man's height above the ground. This method was also employed when placards of like size with written symbols were used. The horse stood 10 paces away and opposite the middle of the series, while Mr. Van Osten stood at his right. Hans was asked to go and point out the cloth of a certain colour or the placard with a certain word upon it. If the cloth lay upon the ground, Hans picked it up with his mouth and carried it to the questioner. If the cloth, like the placards, hung from the cord, he approached, pointed it out with his nose, and then backed up to his original position. Before approaching the objects, Hans was required to indicate, by tapping, the number of the place in the series, counting from left to right, which the cloth or placard occupied. Mr. Van Osten never omitted this requirement. Then the command "Go" was given, and Hans obeyed. As a matter of fact, a slight directive movement of the head or hand was just as effective as the spoken command. The following cases, chosen in a haphazard fashion, show that the horse's indication of the object's place in the series by means of tapping was by no means a guarantee that he would point it out correctly. 5 placards hung from the cord. Mr. Van Osten asked, "What is the position?" counting from left to right, of the placard which has the word "aber" inscribed upon it. Hans answered 3. It was indeed the middle placard. He was then commanded "Go." Thereupon Hans went straight to the 4th placard. Upon another occasion, Hans happened to drop a brown cloth upon a black one. His master asked him, "In which place are there 2 cloths?" Hans responded correctly, "In the 2nd place." To the question, "Which of the 2 is the black one?" he also answered rightly, "The lower one." Upon being asked to get it, he brought the white cloth. The large number and the irregularities of the errors show that there was no manner of intelligence involved in the pointing out process. Thus, during the 2 months of our experimentation, Hans was asked 25 times by Mr. Van Osten to bring the green cloth. Only 6 times did he succeed in the first attempt, while in 5 instances he selected an orange-coloured cloth, 4 times a blue, 3 times a white one. The fact that the errors were equally distributed over the tests with the coloured cloths and those with the placards is strong evidence that the horse's response involved no intellectual process. For if that were the case, then the responses in the tests with the placards would have been very much more difficult, for they would have involved the ability to read, whereas the tests with the coloured cloths demanded only that a few names be remembered. Nevertheless, the horse was as unsuccessful in tests of one kind as he was in those of the other, even when Mr. Van Osten acted as questioner. 50% failures in 78 placard tests, 46% failures in 103 colour tests. The fact that commands which were purposefully enunciated poorly, or else not spoken at all, were executed with just as much accuracy as those given aloud, strengthened us in our supposition. On one occasion I placed a blank placard with the others. When I ordered him to approach tabula rasa, he invariably went to the right one. The following illustrates how he fulfilled quite nonsensical commands. A series of blue and green cloths lay upon the ground. Being asked where the black, the orange, and the yellow cloths lay, Hans shook his head energetically, i.e. they were not there, yet upon being asked to bring them in the order named, he regularly brought one of the blue ones. All this goes to show that Hans did not know the names of the colours, to say nothing of the symbols on the placards. It was plain that here also, as in the other cases, he was controlled by signs made by the questioner, the nature of which I soon discovered. Standing erect, Mr. Van Osten always turned head and trunk in the direction of the cloth or placard desired. Hans, keeping his eye on his master, would proceed in that direction. Even after he had already started out, thanks to his large visual field, one could control his direction by turning slightly more to the right or to the left. If, however, he had already arrived at the row of placards or cloths, this method ceased to be effective, for then he could no longer see the experimenter. It made no difference whether the cloths lay on the ground or were suspended, just like the placards. The following fact justifies the conclusion that the bodily attitude of the questioner was the effective signal. The more numerous the cloths, or the nearer they were placed together, the more difficult one would expect it to be for the horse to select the one indicated by the experimenter. Such was indeed the case, for the number of errors increased with the number of cloths present. But no matter how many cloths there might be, or however closely they were placed, it was always possible to indicate either end of the row, for in that case one had merely to turn to the extreme left or to the extreme right, and might even turn beyond the row. Hans seldom failed in these cases, whereas he made many errors when cloths or placards within the series were wanted. To turn from the nature and number of Hans's errors to their distribution, observation proved the hypothesis that the nearer two cloths lay together, the greater was the chance of their being mistaken for one another. If we designate as error 1 all those cases in which Hans went to cloth 2 instead of to cloth 1, cloth 3 instead of cloth 2, to 5 instead of 4, etc., and as error 2 when he mistook 3 for 1, 4 for 2, in fine, whenever he went 2 places too far to the right or left, and as error 3 whenever he went 3 places too far to either side of the cloth desired, we find the following grouping of errors. With Mr. Van Osten, a total of 63 errors. 73% error 1, 21% error 2, 4% error 3, 1% error 4, 1% error 5. With Mr. Pfungst, a total of 64 errors, 68% error 1, 20% error 2, 11% error 3, 1% error 4, 0% error 5. The most frequently recurring error, therefore, was the one in which the horse, instead of going to the cloth desired, approached the one immediately adjacent. On page 79, I said that Hans's errors were without system, but only in so far as it was impossible to explain them on a basis of the colours which seemingly were mistaken one for the other. A part of a series in which Mr. Van Osten acted as questioner might serve as an illustration. The order given is that of the experimental series as it occurred. 5 coloured cloths were used. Colour of the cloth. Asked for blue, brought orange. Asked for brown, brought orange. Asked for brown, brought green. Asked for brown, brought green. Asked for brown, brought yellow. Asked for brown, brought green. Asked for green, brought blue. Asked for green, brought orange. Place of cloth. Asked for 5, brought 4. Asked for 2, brought 4. Asked for 2, brought 3. Asked for 2, brought 3. Asked for 2, brought 1. Asked for 2, brought 3. Asked for 3, brought 5. Asked for 3, brought 4. The interpretation of this series, which it would be hard to explain by a reference to the colours which were mistaken, is simply this. Cloths lying near together were regularly mistaken on the part of the horse. Experimental control of the questioner's movements decided the question. If the experimenter at first indicated the proper direction and then turned about after the horse had already started forward, he was as a rule misled. When the questioner did not face the cloths at all, but turned away at right angles, or when he turned his back upon them, Hans was completely at sea. If, on the other hand, the cloths were arranged not in a row, but as several heaps, so that one might turn to a particular heap, but could not indicate a particular cloth, then Hans would regularly go to the proper heap, but would always bring forth the wrong cloth. After much persuasion, Mr. von Osten consented to make a series of these tests himself. Hans's failures were deplorable. He would take up first one cloth, then another, turn again to the first, etc. We would mention, however, that this apparent searching was not done spontaneously, but in response to Mr. von Osten's calls, such as, "See there, the blue," etc. Every time Mr. von Osten called, Hans would drop the cloth he was holding in his mouth, or he would turn away from the one he was about to grasp, and would then try another one. In addition to these visual signs, the horse received auditory signals in these tests, as in all others in which he was required to bring objects. As soon as the questioner noticed that Hans was about to take up the wrong cloth, all that was necessary to make him correct his error was to give some sort of exclamation, such as "wrong," "look you," "blue," etc. Hans would pass on as long as the calling continued. If he was picking up, or about to pick up, a cloth when the exclamation was made, he would go on to the next, but if at the time he was on his way to a certain cloth, he would change his direction in response to the call. If he stood before one of the pieces at the time, but had not lowered his head, he would pass on to the next. In all this he would adhere to a certain routine of procedure. If he was approaching a series from the right, then a call would cause him to turn to the left. If he was coming from the left, he would turn to the right. If he had approached the row of cloths near the centre, he would turn, in response to the questioner's calls, to the left, seldom, very seldom, to the right. Mr. von Osten did not seem to be able to control the responses of the horse entirely. As a rule, but not always, one call sufficed to make Hans pass on to the next cloth. If too many calls were given, he would often go too far. Loud exclamations were superfluous. These statements are not mere assertions, but are founded upon the records of the results. The tests in which calls were made show a larger percentage of correct responses than do those without calls. Of a total of 103 tests with coloured cloths, which Mr. von Osten performed for us, only 37% brought forth successful responses on the part of the horse when visual signs were the only directives, and when there were no directions by means of calls, whereas the total percentage of successful responses was 54%, if we add to the above those in which the vocal exclamations helped to bring about success. The corresponding percentages for the total of 78 tests of the placards were 23% and 50%. In a total of 110 colour tests, I myself obtained 31% correct responses under the first head and 56% under the second head. In a total of 59 tests with placards, I succeeded in getting 31% correct under the first head and 46% under the second head. We must note that without verbal admonition, only 1/3 of the tests brought forth correct responses, whereas 1/2 succeeded when those in which calls were used were added. Still, this is a relatively poor showing. in the most favourable series that Mr. von Osten ever obtained in our presence, and there was only one such, 50% of the responses without admonition were correct, and 90% when all the correct reactions, both with and without admonition, were taken into account. Not all the places in a row required the same amount of assistance by means of calls. Those positions which needed the most help were those which it was most difficult to indicate to the horse by the visual sign, i.e. the attitude of the questioner's body. We noted above, page 81, that the cloths at either end of the row were less difficult to point out than those nearer the middle. If our hypothesis holds true, we would expect that the end cloths would involve fewer auditory signals in the process of pointing out, and those within the row a greater number of such signs. By way of illustration, I will cite one series of tests in which Mr. von Osten was questioner, chosen not because it is most conformal to my hypothesis, but because it is the longest, 48 consecutive tests with 5 cloths, which I have. In the upper row, I am placing the successful responses without auditory signs, in the lower those involving both auditory and visual signs. Place of the cloth, 1. Number of successful responses. Visual signs only, 5. Visual and auditory signs, 5. Place of the cloth, 2. Visual signs only, 2. Visual and auditory signs, 5. Place of the cloth, 3. Visual signs only, 1. Visual and auditory signs, 8. Place of the cloth, 4. Visual signs only, 2. Visual and auditory signs, 5. Place of the cloth, 5. Visual signs only, 4. Visual and auditory signs, 5. We see that without verbal admonition, the first and last places are most favourable for success, the second and fourth far less, and the middle least favourable. These differences disappear when admonitions are introduced, for all the places then have the same number of correct responses, with the exception of the middle, which now has even more than the others. One more experiment which I made will close the discussion. The following colours were placed from right to left: orange, blue, red, yellow, black, green. I turned my back upon them, and therefore could guide the horse by verbal commands only. I asked him to bring the orange. Hans approached with the yellow. I now called 3 times, allowing a short interval between the calls. At the first "go," he passed from the yellow to the red, at the second from the red to the blue, and at the third from the blue to the orange, which he then proceeded to pick up and bring to me. I have noted this same thing in Mr. von Osten's tests, although there were often other factors entering in. By exercising the utmost precision in facing the cloths, and by using, in addition, suitable oral signs, I succeeded in getting Hans to bring, successfully, each one of the 6 cloths in the row, and without a single error, and all this in the presence of Mr. Schillings, who did not have the slightest notion of the secret of my success. We need hardly say, in passing, that all that was true of the test with coloured cloths was also true of the tests in which the placards were used. It was all the same to the horse whichever was placed before him. We have thus tested all of the horse's supposed achievements. None of them stood the critical test. It would have been gratifying to have repeated some of the experiments, and to have made Hans the object of further psychological investigations, but unfortunately he was no longer at my disposal after the publication of the report of the December Commission. Some may say that we have had almost enough of a good thing, but we must bear in mind that many of the tests which were carried out, such as those in which the method was that of procedure without knowledge, those in which the earmuffs were used, those in which distractions were introduced, had previously been made by other persons. See pages 41f, 45, 63, and with other results than ours. A more thorough test, therefore, would have been doubly desirable. End of section 4.